Hey everybody, welcome in. Welcome to SEAL Team 16. It's a variant of SEAL Team 7 based on the Final Fantasy title numbered accordingly. Final Fantasy 16. So this is a roundtable discussion on the ending of Final Fantasy 16. So I cannot stress spoiler warnings enough. This is definitely a spoiler-filled discussion. There's literally nothing off the table. If you do not want the ending of Final Fantasy XVI spoiled to an extreme degree, this is not the video for you. I've brought people in that have finished the entire game experience, have taken granular looks at the lore, and have had enough time to emotionally process and speak intelligently on the ending of Final Fantasy XVI. We're going to cover a few basic topics. One, the ambiguity of the ending. Two, the content of the ending. And three, the antagonist and how the antagonist functions in the story, and did the antagonist work. So I'm going to introduce everybody. I'm going to start with my good friend Ryan, aka Night Sky Prince. If you want to just say hi and introduce yourself a little bit, what you do.
Hello everyone, I'm Night Sky Prince. You may also know me as Night Sky Emperor, Night Sky Icon, Night Sky King, Night Sky in general. I'm happy to be here. Resident Final Fantasy 16 hype man. Been a big fan of Creative Business Unit 3 for a long time now. Also big player of Final Fantasy 14. So I've just been really into this team. The way they tend to tell stories, the way they approach just everything with their games. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk all of these Final Fantasy 16 spoilers with you guys. So, yeah, let's do it.
All right, and next I'd like to introduce EyesOnBee, also a friend and great content creator. You want to give us a little spiel on you?
Yes. Hello, my name is EyesOnBee. I've been a day one fan of what FF16 was going to be since that first trailer. I am somebody who has played through all of the games meticulously in different ways with mods. I've speed run some of the games, stuff like that. So I know lots of weird, obscure facts about the game, and that's something I really pride myself on. And what drew me to 16 was the fact it looks like an Ivalice game, and you definitely can get that, which we can talk about later. So I was very excited for this game to come out and play it and just digest everything it had to offer.
Excellent. And I'm excited about that stuff too, the evilly stuff in general, the amount of flair. We may very well get to that. So next I'd like to introduce new and upcoming creator that I've been trying to push aggressively because I think he's just got the sauce. His last two videos in particular, I think really structurally align with what I think the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth project and remake in general is trying to do, and he does so very concisely, and I can't praise him enough. But I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell us what he does. Subtxt, take it away.
Hi, I'm Subtxt. It's very cool to be here because I first found I started making my videos because of finding SEAL Team 7 back in probably about a year and a half ago. It was like before a drive, and I'd worn out all my sort of listens of the Max Dude sort of podcasts and spoiler casts, and I was looking for new people to talk about F7, and found one of the episodes and listened to it on this drive, and I was like blown away. There were so many cool ideas in it, so very cool to be here. Yeah, so I make videos about Final Fantasy VII. And primarily at the moment, I used to work in games journalism way back in the day when I was like a teenager, writing reviews and all that kind of stuff. So even all the kind of discourse around the reviews for 16 was kind of an interesting experience, having had that kind of firsthand experience of reviewing games back in the day. But I was very just very super excited just to 4 16s, a play 16, kind of like EyesOnBee was talking about. My kind of top overall Final Fantasy games are 7 and Tactics and 14. So like two of those games really kind of flow into this because of those Evilise vibes that EyesOnBee was talking about, as well as CB3 with 14 and their experience and bringing that to the single player mainline entries. And then, 7, that sort of being this big watershed moment for the franchise. 16 felt like it was going to be this other one. And so it was really exciting to sort of see it all in kind of happening live. And so just looking forward to talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So thank you for being here. Thank you, live audience, and YouTube in the future for being here. And if you feel motivated and you want to keep listening to discussions like this, feel free to drop a like and subscribe and click the notification bell, etc. Sorry, just got to do the thing. Welcome to the content creation world, guys. Okay, so let's just get into it. So Final Fantasy 16 had, I think, had all this energy, and it really played itself very close to its chest from a marketing perspective. The final struggle, like the general antagonist set, how the story unfolds, most of that occurs outside of areas displayed in the trailers. So most of us went into this with literally no idea how any of this was going to unfold, how the story was going to play out. And so it did set this kind of expectation for the way the story was going to unfold. It was going to be about maybe Clive and his relationship, specifically with his relationship with his, with his brother, and maybe, trying to avenge the world as a result of, his brother's loss. And that was kind of the idea that you got from the trailers. There were hints in there, and I think people that looked pretty aggressively knew that there was going to be more to it than that. And I think we're all in that category. Ultimately what ends up happening with the narrative is that that general relational context is subverted very early on, and we get this grander kind of look at how the use of power branches into things like slavery, planetary destruction and environmental loss. We see, this, there's this rich history built into the world where there's this, fallen civilization that rose and fell between the beginning and the end, and there's a ton of context that sort of comes into play until we get to the ending. And the ending is incredibly ambiguous. And this is not the first Final Fantasy to do an ambiguous ending. Final Fantasy VII, the original's ending, was notably ambiguous, and it's one of the most critically hailed ambiguous endings, probably in video games and in storytelling in general. I just want first to ask, do you guys think that in the case of Final Fantasy XVI, the ambiguity of the ending served the game's story in a positive way? And I'm actually going to start with Night Sky Prince.
Oh boy. I'm a big fan of the ambiguous Final Fantasy ending. Usually because I feel like there's a lot of good thematic weight to them, and a lot of good discussion happens afterward. And also a lot of times I feel like the ambiguity is better than if they had answered things specifically. So I'm a big fan of Final Fantasy VII OG's ending. There's a lot of people out there, shockingly enough, tasteless, I know, that hate FF7 OG's ending. I think that is a brilliant ending. And not to go all too much on a side tangent, it goes back to 16. But one of the reasons that FF7 OG's ending is so brilliant is because it doesn't answer the question about whether Cloud and Barrett and Tifa and all those guys live. It's not about them. It's not about the individual. The point is that the collective survives, which is, thematically what that story is really all about, the planet's survival. And the fact that the planet goes on, and the fact that you see Nanaki's descendants, those things to me are way greater. And the ambiguity in there allows you to kind of discuss, whether you thought that the party survived. And of course, all those things are then later on, given clarity by the compilation. But that ambiguity, that shock factor that you get at the end was really beautiful. And, I think that had they answered, specifically whether everyone survived and all the specifics of that ending, it wouldn't have left you there sitting with the controller and your jaw dropped and you thinking about that game every single day for like the next few years, or at least that was my experience first completed game. I think Final Fantasy XVI's ambiguous ending also really helped to serve it, because again, it's something that has stayed in my mind. It's something that I'm, really thinking about. The decisions that Clive made with magic, and the decision to get rid of it, and ultimately whether or not that costed him his life. The purpose of healing Joshua's body, right? Like, said that bring Joshua back to life, right? As the Phoenix, or the Phoenix's power. Did he just basically mend a dead body for like no purpose, or was that actually like, or was there actually purpose in that? These sorts of things are, they're kind of powerful in a way for it to give us discussion, and I feel like it allows the game to continue to live on in our heads. And I also think that from a business standpoint, it's really gonna sell some Ultimanias and some DLC. So I really think you can't go wrong either way, artistic or business wise.
Okay, all right. That's interesting. I didn't consider the business element to that.
Yeah.
I do want to. I might circle back to this, but I think since you're here and you're the Night Sky Prince, the ambiguity of, well, I mean, what seemingly unambiguous but turned ambiguous ending of Final Fantasy 15.
Yeah.
Compare that to 16. What are your thoughts, and how does that, like, with the addition of DLC, etc., with 16, do we see DLC as being a thing that should answer
right
the ambiguity?
Okay, so I think the fundamental difference here is that with Final Fantasy 15, the DLC served to fill in the middle of the story. Right? There were entire things that were clearly missing from the story. And there's always a degree of debate on what an incomplete versus a complete game is. But I think when you have a situation where one of the main characters of the game goes blind off screen, it is never ever explained how he went blind in the course of the main game. They never touch on it. They never even so much as foreshadow or allude to what happened. It is just left a complete mystery. And it's also jarring in a way how none of the characters even deeply on-screen question it, right? Especially when you know the context of them not being there in episode Ignis, right? Like, that none of them were there. So it's even more weird that, like, nobody answers. It's just completely off screen. And that's ambiguity in a bad way. It's ambiguity in a bad way when it's something that needs to be shown in order to make the entire story coherent in the first place. Because otherwise you're just left with, I really don't get it. It starts to thematically fall apart. And so in the case of Final Fantasy 15, I don't know if like its ending necessarily actually even helps sell DLC, because at the end it kind of just felt like, where was the middle of the story? Whereas this, while it is, nice to be able to get like maybe some finite answers on what happened there from a business perspective. I mean, from like a business marketing perspective of saying, like, hey, you know, we'll give you like a little bit more clarity on those answers. I actually don't necessarily think that clarity is necessary on what happened. I think that the DLC, which is probably going to be about Leviathan, can just continue to just, it could just be entirely about that, like maybe a point in time that we didn't know about and some other characters doing something else or whatever. But I don't think it necessarily has to clarify the ending. However, I do think that if it could give like a little bit more resolution on that, again, marketing perspective wise, totally gonna sell.
Okay.
Just to jump in on that too, you know, I remember with 15, because when you asked a question just now, Baby Seal, I was like,
Yeah.
is 15's ending ambiguous? I was thinking for a moment, because in my mind, I'm like, well, it seems pretty clear what happens to Noctis and then what happens to the lands and the light sort of returning. And in my mind, I was like, was it ambiguous? And my memory of 15's experience, at least, was that the sort of core narrative was a bit ambiguous. Like the core journey of a lot of the characters was the ambiguous part rather than the conclusion. So like that's why 15 was so jarring of experience. And then I think the big lesson, and I know some people love 15 and how everything was done in 15, but like the big lesson that I think to take away from 15 is not that DLC is bad, right? It's that DLC that is filling in holes rather than sort of like just adding to the overall story and experience is bad. Like to sort of like for you to have to play those things in order to fundamentally understand the main story, that kind of gets in the way, or at least to understand those characters, right? I forget the other character who has like who's the like the fun happy one that has like you have the really nice moment with on the roof of one of the motels. Prompto. Yeah, like there's a whole element of his story that's like buried in the DLC too that he references at one point later on in the game, and you're like, I hadn't played the DLC yet, so I was kind of thrown off by the comment that he made about him and who he is and his identity or whatever that is. And it's like the DLC fills that in. It's like it's kind of important information to have within like for that moment to really land. And I don't think 16 really has any of those moments. There's questions certainly in terms of like really truly understanding Barnabas's motivations or maybe some of the elements, but you don't feel like anything's like missing. And I felt like 15 things felt missing that then needed to be filled in.
Sure. I just for clarity, I do think that 15's ending was really clear. I guess what I'm talking about is Dawn of the Future, which was, you know, like kind of not a retcon, but like sort of an alternate ending thing that added a little bit of stuff. And I don't think that was yeah. I wanted to see would you guys want something like that for 16? But to stay kind of on the topic, I do want to hear B. What were your thoughts on the ambiguity of the ending? Do you like it? Do you think that it was good? Do you want them to change it?
The ambiguity for me only bothered me in one respect, and that was Leviathan, because as I had perceived everything with the whole Ultima and mythos concept was that Clive kind of was incomplete. So, but I don't think that actually matters in the grand scheme of things. Like, I don't know, that was something that my entire chat while I was playing through it and myself, we just kept going, but like, wait, what about Leviathan? And at the same time, I feel like that's a beautiful opportunity for more if they wanted to. But if they didn't do more and say the game flopped, I still feel fulfilled by this story. Where we're all talking about 15, I did not feel fulfilled by the information I received throughout that game to feel like there was a resolution fully. Like the game had an ending, that is for sure, but there was still so much to me that I didn't feel was explained, like we've already discussed. Like I have to wonder, I like to have things to think about afterwards. I don't want everything to be fully answered. And I feel like that kind of helps establish a legacy for the game as well. Because it's not just right now. Like, everybody wants to talk about how important it is that this gets Game of the Year. I think for Final Fantasy as a series, it's really what makes it stand out and still important is the fact that games that were made 30 years ago, people are still playing today and having discussions over. And I think an ending like this allows for that to happen. The other weird thing about the process of the game is that I actually predicted the novel thing showing up at the end of the game. And that was actually a joke of mine. My husband and I were discussing off stream, and I said, this book thing keeps coming up in all the side quests. Just writing a novel just kept coming up, and I was like, what if it's like Final Fantasy Tactics? And at the end, the major statement is about how history isn't essentially how it's always told. And I do kind of feel like it's there in a lot of senses, where with Tactics, Ramza in history is regarded as a heretic, but the reality was he was a hero. So I thought that was actually a really cool callback in a sense, even though it doesn't play out in the same way. It's a lot more clear cut in Tactics, where this leaves it up to your imagination as to what happens. The other thing is I feel like the strongest point to me for the entire game was the characters. I cared for everyone. I wanted them to endure, and in the end it feels like no matter what happens to Joshua, Dion, Clive, everyone else truly does live on. And, well, bonus points, Torgal lives.
Yeah, they made sure of that.
Yeah.
I remember there was so much conversation around the Torgal thing. And I was like, it's like, no, don't. I was like, that's such a crutch. Well, so many games do it. I played like 5 games in the past 5 years that killed some kind of animal in it. And it's like, just don't do it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So
And you know what's
Subtxt.
more effective? I just wanted to say, what's always more effective to me is like the animal like outliving the master, like the pet outliving the master. Like that to me always stings more than like the pet dying. Because there's something like, it's kind of like, when your pet dies, it's tragic. It hurts a lot, it's like losing a family member. But eventually you kind of like, you grow to like live on, like without the dog, right? But for the dog, you're like its entire life. Like its entire life is you.
What are you?
And
what?
so it's such a more like fundamental like uprooting, I feel like, for like that dog's life.
God.
Like it's like than it is like for yours, like when the roles are reversed. So I feel like that to me is like more tragic than. But anyway, that's all I want to add. Yeah.
I'm gonna give little known Night Sky Prince lore that he doesn't talk about enough. He loves dogs. He won't say it. He loves dogs. Like, I remember there was this one time that like he just found a dog out in the world, and it was like the happiest I'd ever seen him. He turned into Night Sky Boy. Like it was the only time I've ever seen him like become a child, just full of the wonder, the adult life had taken out of him. Subtext. I want to get your thoughts on the specific question, and does the ambiguity of the ending serve the narrative purpose of this game? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I actually it's good to get to me last because I had to think for a little bit on it. But I think it does, though I understand how people might react differently to it, right? I think there's been a long tradition of like ambiguous endings sort of hitting people differently, whether it serves a story or not, right? Like all of the Last of Us endings, are not necessarily ambiguous, but they leave them fairly open, right? Like there's questions, in terms of how people walk away from certain conversations and things like that, or what happens next. and even like thinking back on film, right? Probably the most notorious one to me is like No Country for Old Men, where it's that it's a conversation. Like the guy, it's a monologue. It just sort of ends, and the movie ends,
Right.
and it doesn't feel like the real ending to that story until you kind of think about it,
Right.
and even then, it might not be fully satisfying for a lot of people.
I think that was one of the most effective endings in the history of cinema. But
Yeah.
go on.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
But the for 16, it didn't feel like it didn't feel that as jarring as that, right? Like I think with both of those examples, they kind of, at least with the first Last of Us and with that film, they sort of just cut at what feels like a little bit of an abrupt moment. Whereas this one, there is like a full, Clive is laying on the beach, he's looking at the sky, you cut to the hideaway, you're seeing the characters, Jill and Torgal kind of go off and they're looking out into the sky. And there is sort of, it feels like an ending is playing out, whereas those other ones, it almost doesn't feel like an ending. So for me, it's not necessarily ambiguous. It's just there's open questions, right? And I guess it's kind of ambiguous in terms of the fates of all those characters. But I think it serves 16 because the whole point of it, all Clive was trying to do, and kind of carry on the legacy of Sid, was trying to attain that freedom, right? Trying to sort of break free of sort of the bonds and to quote Professor Noctis's recent video, like break the cycle, right? Like break the cycle of the mother crystals and sort of these one of the very first the last line of dialogue before cutting to the title screen is when Annabella says, all in its right place. And that is kind of the core thought that both Annabella as sort of this intimate villain has, and then Ultima has as a sort of like meta, just giant, like big galaxy, defining sort of villain. He also has pretty much the same point of view in terms of, I think at one point I wrote down a note of like one of the things that he says where he's like, we're here. I guess I didn't write down the dialogue, but he was basically challenging Clive as to like, why would you sort of defy this? Like, why would you sort of like defy sort of your place in all of this? And so it was kind of interesting to see the sort of shades of like how Annabella talked about people's place in the world and how Ultima also kind of reflected that.
Agreed.
So Clive pushes against that.
Yeah, he pushes against that, and so I hear what you're saying, and it's that. So the point of the game, the point of the narrative, was to create the world we see in the post-credit scene. This world where people can, live and die as they choose, and to me, I thought more people would be on board with this for me, but the most emotional moment in the game, bar none for me, was in the post-credit scene, and the little boy is blowing into the fire that and he's getting over the frustration of not being able to just make fire. Like, he has to blow into the fire, he's got to use the flint, and as he blows into the fire starts and the Final Fantasy theme kicks in, and because that was the purpose of this game, was to celebrate the ordinary magic that mankind, free of any bondage, is able to make. As hard as it is, the pain that it builds. So in that sense, I completely agree. That the greater narrative point, of the story was concluded. The ambiguous fates of the characters, specifically, I agree that maybe we didn't need to know, for that big question to be solved, but they threw this mystery at the end of the post-credit scene that said, Final Fantasy was the name of the book, and it was written by Joshua Rossfield, and this was a big question mark. This was a thing like, wait, didn't they both die, or didn't Joshua die at least, and but did Clive die? You know, there's this. It was intentionally created to make us a little bit confused about the fates, specifically of those characters, not necessarily of the world struggle. And so I'm curious, does the fates of those characters, like, does their ambiguity have a purpose to the meta narrative? And I mean, I've got my own opinion on it. Or do you think this was perhaps like an open-ended tale meant specifically to be solved later in maybe DLC or when they had the chance somehow? So I'm going to kind of repose that question to everybody. I'm going to start again with, or I'm going to go backwards this time. So I'm going to start with Subtxt.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that I really liked about how, you know, NSP brought up FF7, because that's the other kind of, like, the post-credit scene in FF7 when you see Red 13 and he runs up and it's 500 years later. That gives you a conclusion to the primary question of the story, right? Which is, you know, or the primary conflict, which was saving the planet. Like, how do we, you know, undo all of this Mako stuff and all this Mako extraction that's killing the planet so that the planet can endure. And then at the very end, you're seeing that the planet is enduring. A lot of people then kind of asked a lot of questions as to, but did the characters survive? Did humanity survive? Et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's, I think it's a little bit been retconned, but like there's a similar thing here, right? Where the core question at the end of that was, you know, was it all worth it, right? Like, was that, if it was a sacrifice, whether they lived or died, like, did they succeed in ultimately sort of freeing the world from the shackles of the crystals and undoing the blight and all of that? And the answer seems pretty conclusively that yes, right? Like, the world seems to be flourishing. It's a very verdant land, as mentioned in FF7, and they're so far beyond the sort of thought of magic and crystals that it's only a fairy tale at this point, right? Like, those are just silly stories, as the mom puts it. And meanwhile, when we're playing the game, that's how the world was ruled, you know? Like, the dominance, everyone knew the dominance. Everyone was, you know, it was all sort of, it was set up under those parameters. So I guess when it comes to for FF16 and the characters and whether their fate answer your like actual question, I think there's like it's a, I don't know if they plan to answer it conclusively in DLC. I think if they have DLC, then that will answer it, because I would imagine that it would pick up after the story. They could do stories in between. You know, they can cover maybe the 5 years between Sid's death and when you jump to Clive when he's 33. They may fill in gaps with Jill, or they may even do something with like Sid and Benedicta back in the day. I don't know. Who knows what they do with the DLC? And then there's Leviathan, and that can be that seems what everyone thinks it's going to be about. And I think that could add some more. I don't know the Leviathan stuff and all the conversation that's happened around that as much as I think everyone else probably in this panel. But I think ultimately their fates are, they've given us enough clues as to, you know, whether they survived. And you can sort of choose the ending that you want for the characters. I think Clive ended up probably like living, and just given the quill that he's given by Harpocrates, and you can sort of like fill in that blank. But so I don't know if I answered the question exactly, but I'll pass it from here.
We'll put a pin in the who lives and dies thing, because I do want to get everybody's takes on that. So Ryan, very specifically just on the character fates. Like, I feel like Final Fantasy was solved. Like, you know, Final Fantasy 16's ending solved the conflict of Final Fantasy. Even resolved the relationship between the Ultima Collective and humanity and the evolution from mythos to logos was very thematically complete. What is the value, the narrative value, not the financial value? What would you say the narrative value of giving enough, because like Subtxt mentioned, they gave a tremendous tapestry of facts to choose our own fate for the characters. Like every single camp for who lives and who dies has evidence to choose from. What is the narrative value of that in your mind?
I think that there is power kind of in both, right? Like in both of those roads, where you can see, for example, if Clive died, I can see how that would be poetic in a way, right? Because originally he kind of went this whole journey thinking that Joshua had died and that he had killed him, and then all the lives of the dominants that he had took. And so this kind of reverses that role and flips it back on its head and makes it so that it's kind of the other way around, that it's come full circle in a way, and it kind of puts it into the cycle. I also think that there's kind of a certain beauty in the fact that perhaps he dies and Joshua lives, right? Like, so if Joshua lives, then I also think too that there's now this journey that Joshua has to go on, where Joshua has to deal with the loss of his brother, right? Like something that Clive had been, or thought that he had been dealing with this whole time. And also too, thematically, Joshua being the Phoenix, and this being kind of, like his final resurrection too. And either road that you go down, whether it's Clive lives, and he is able to break that cycle, and he's able to live as a free man, or whether it's Clive dies, or whether it's Joshua lives, or whether it's that they both end up living too. I feel like there is value in it, but I think that everyone is probably going to value what they specifically value in one of those, right? And people are going to value one more than the other. And this is kind of a big question in storytelling, I think, in general, is that what level of answers is too many answers, and what is good ambiguity, right? Like, what is ambiguity that allows people to kind of like read things for themselves, into themselves, and sometimes too, by leaving things ambiguous and allowing people to paint the exact picture that they believe, you give them space to finish the story in the way that that satisfies them in what's most reflective of their life experiences. And I feel like a lot of times that is more powerful than giving a definitive answer. Right?
I like it.
It's almost like a horror film, right? It's like the monster is most scary whenever you don't show the monster. You just give like a little glimpse of it, right?
Yeah.
It's like that with other emotions too.
Yeah.
It's crazy because as you mentioned it too, I'm like I don't know which fate for the characters I would prefer, even, when you were going through all those different scenarios that's the game gives you, or people that can kind of interpret. I'm like, I would be satisfied with a lot of those different, it doesn't impact the experience for me to think of like if someone dies or if someone didn't, or all of those fates sort of are satisfying in some way or another.
This actually leads into what I was going to say.
Right. You're next. Yeah.
Okay. So looking at the bigger picture, I actually interpret it as being written as if they were thinking it could be the last Final Fantasy game. And I don't think that's the case at all anymore. I definitely feel like there's definitely going to be more, especially with the success of 7 and all of that. But there's been this like weird implied conversation for a really long time that like, hey, if this doesn't do well, maybe they're not going to do anymore. Maybe it's just going to be remakes. Maybe it's going to be, just the MMO from here on out. And so, again, I had mentioned this earlier, I feel like it was more of a legacy thing of honoring everything that came before it, and that ultimately Clive's fate was to do what he did, and it was to save the world, in a sense. And that's why, for me, like, I don't care, because no matter what happens to him, I feel like I feel at ease with his ending. Like, he seemed content with it. Obviously, it's sad for Jill, but
Right.
I was that person for a really long time who was like, this isn't going to be a love story. I was wrong. I admit that. They have a beautiful love for each other.
Yeah.
Beautiful. But I don't think that always has to be the core of every story.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm.
Okay, so I'm going to give you guys all the real answer. You save it till the end. To me, I found that the ambiguity of the ending, the fact that we had all of these choices as to how to interpret the ending, was the core theme of Final Fantasy. It was the mission that Sid had, to live and choose as man chooses, like to live and die as man chooses. So the agency to make decisions on how we interpret this ending is meta commentary on Final Fantasy and what the core theme of the game is. And I thought us individually interpreting how these characters live the rest of their lives, us telling the stories, like the concept of the character getting the pen, the character, Harpocrates giving Clive the pen, he's giving you the pen. You're writing the end of these stories because it's now your choice. That's what the meta narrative of Final Fantasy is about. And I am personally of the opinion that if they do even an ounce of DLC on this, and I think they will, they should not, conclusively not, answer these questions for us. I think
I agree.
it genuinely undermines what this game was about. For me, individually, I understand the need for certainty. I love the comfort that it brings, and there is a time and a place for that. I think that artistically, this game from the beginning was one of the most cohesive and comprehensively told stories in the Final Fantasy compendium. There's very few things that weren't connected, even through active time lore. If you're like, oh, that's kind of a plot hole, compared to any other Final Fantasy, this game was really short on plot holes, really short on ambiguity until the end. So there's no way that wasn't a choice. Every narrative decision up to this point was incredibly intentional for some reason that served the overall narrative. There was something that connected everything to the core points, and we'll get into that more with the Ultima civilization and the actual breakdown of the lore. But personally, I think that it would be a huge misstep, no matter how many people are clamoring for it. I don't think that's the art that was intended to be made. And sometimes the dollar does change art. We've seen it in Final Fantasy, but I hope it doesn't do so here. That's just my personal take. And I know it's not the most popular one. I've seen a lot of discourse on this. Please make it, so that I know what happened. And I get that. But also, do you want companies doing that? Do you want to incentivize, like, pay locking the actual fates of the characters, or pay locking the ending of games behind DLC? I think one of the most astonishingly bad cases of that just happened recently, with the game that shall not be named, that was supposed to be a predecessor to Dead Space, and it was almost like a middle finger to the concept. And so I don't want companies doing that. I don't want to incentivize that too for that reason. But I also understand people wanting to know, What did the writer think happens? I think the writer wanted us to decide for ourselves, and I think just like every other decision they made. So
I just want to say I'm glad. I'm so glad you're because I've run into a lot of people that say like, oh well, if there's DLC, I want it to be Clive, and I have been like immediately as I finished it, I was like, I really would prefer the survival of those characters to not get answered, and the DLC to just go to the past and flesh out more of the world. Because as much as I love Clive as a character, I want to know more about everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautifully built world. Yeah, with room for tons of stories.
When I was thinking about DLC, I was immediately thinking of, I want to see more Sid's journey. I want to see more of Joshua in those in-between years. I want to see, I didn't think at all about like post-game,
Yeah.
And just to add, or like to support what you were saying even more, Baby Seal, like it's such a choice that this game gives you it drowns you in answers. You know what I mean? Like it has the active time lore during the cutscenes. It has it has Hippocrates who has like deep dives into every topic. It has Vivian who has the entire timeline of the entire story, the relationships between all the characters throughout every single kind of like point in time. But what it doesn't have, and I could be misremembering, but every time I paused the ending of the game, there was no active time lore. Like there was no answers. It just like it was the one time that the game did not give you any answers. It's a game designed to give you answers at almost every point in time, and at the end, they're like, no, just sort of take it.
I love it. Okay, so let's just put a bow on the ambiguity and just I'll ask each of you, how did you interpret the fates of the characters? Who lived, who died? If you want to give a little bit of a like why, feel free. If not, you don't have to. So I'll start with B. Who lives, who dies?
Okay. I think Joshua definitely dies.
Okay.
I don't feel like there's a chance. But then again, we thought he died before, so maybe there's a chance that the Phoenix rises again. Who knows? But I just felt like that would make sense. That he survived, he worked in the shadows for all of that time, he saved his brother, and he helped save the world, essentially. I just feel like his fate made sense to me. And I would be fine with him living, but I just feel like that seemed very finalized that he was done for. Clive, I could see living and maybe losing his arm. But again, I don't know if that's something I want to see. I don't know that I want to see how he is afterwards. I feel like if he lives, obviously we know he goes and he hangs out with Jill and they have a cool life together, and that's beautiful and wonderful. But like, I don't know that that's what I care to see in a game. I want to see conflict and how it gets resolved. Dion, I really hope he lived. I love Dion so much, and I hate that in our first, openly gay character on screen, you lift him up, you make him a great character, and then he dies. Like, he dies with honor, obviously. But I really hope he lives. He's like the one character I'm just like, please. It's a heavy, it's a far fall though, so I'm slightly doubtful in that regard.
I could have hit the water. Who knows?
True.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, no one dies from falls that you don't see.
Fantasy, yeah. Maybe
So
Dean. Yeah.
If you go with Game of Thrones rules, Joshua died on screen. So I personally believe he died. And I thought he lived when I played the demo. I've always thought that he was going to be the hooded person.
Yeah.
So that partially ended up being true. I technically didn't consider him dying in the demo in a lot of ways because we never actually saw him dead. And so I think because we saw him, he is. Dion, we didn't see a body. We just saw him falling. He's injured. Clive, it's a little more debatable. But that's why I think maybe he just loses his arm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Night Sky Prince.
Wouldn't it be cool if like Clive did lose his arm and then Mitt makes him like a robotic one and then we really go full Nero?
Yeah, Nero and Devil Breaker. It's his Devil Breaker.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you how many times I've had that joke with Susie. We were like, oh, Devil Breaker time.
Yep.
Yep.
Here's what I think. I think that initially I was like 100% like Clive lives, Joshua dies. And now that I'm really thinking on it, now I'm thinking Clive dies, Joshua lives. Because I think what I can't get over now is the scene where Clive goes and mends Joshua's flesh. There was a point in showing us that, like, very specifically. And I mean, clearly Joshua had to be dead there, but there had to be something to that scene, that very specific shot, their very specific choice for them to show us Clive mending Joshua like that. I feel like there is something to that is definitely intentional in what they were getting for, and it's not just him. I don't think it's just him healing a corpse, right? Like, I feel like there has to be something a little bit more to it than that. And then at the end, right, we see the book, and the book is by Joshua Rosfield. And I think that there is something like really interesting about that too, because I think you can draw like a lot of parallels between like Ultima and kind of like the Old Testament God.
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of in that same parallel make Joshua the New Testament God, Jesus, right? And so the real question then becomes, did Clive write the book? Did Clive take yet another name? Did Clive take the name of Joshua Rosfield and write the book himself? Or is that Joshua writing the book himself? So is it the disciple or is it the actual Jesus writing the Bible, right? I also love that the implication of that is that Final Fantasy is literally like the creation story of man, right? This is kind of neat if you think about it. Like Final Fantasy like literally is the Bible by the end.
That's true.
Yeah.
Subtext.
Yeah, it's really hard because, you know, when EyesOnBee was talking, I was like, yeah, that's what I also thought the same thing. Actually, my very, very, very first interpretation of the ending was probably way too straightforward. I thought Clive died. I thought Joshua died. I thought, you know, like, I thought it was kind of as shown. And then, and even with the post-credit scene with the book, with the Joshua thing, I think I was just so still taking in everything that I was like, I saw it and I saw it say Final Fantasy Joshua Rosfield, and I thought that was that's a weird subtitle glitch or something like that. Like, rather than actually just clarifying that that was kind of the author of the book and the name of the book. You know, I think the way I interpreted it, at least, is I think I go with the sort of like common interpretation that EyesOnBee was mentioning in terms of, I think, Clive lived because they show the curse kind of coming to his hands, but it's still on the very fingertips, right? And him as a vessel, they kept talking all throughout the story about how he was sort of made to be able to, you know, use all that ether and kind of and he was the vessel for that reason, that he can kind of channel more ether than the typical dominant. People always remark about like how it's not affecting him. You know, he's taking on all these dominance powers, he's using them, you know, constantly, and it doesn't really seem to affect him the way that it affects other people, including like Sid and Jill. So there's something special to his sort of nature. I know at the end he sort of second guesses that, because he, you know, after he mends Joshua's skin, he says, this is too much, you know, for my body to handle, so I'm going to do with it while I have it. But but then he still seems to withstand it a bit. Obviously, when he's lying on the beach, there's a bit of the curse on his hands, but it doesn't really seem to be creeping throughout the rest of his body. I don't really see it in his face. His face is maybe a little bit more pale, but I wasn't getting that feeling from it. And I have to rewatch the scene again, but I've heard a lot of people say that Jill sort of looks hopeful at the very end when she looks up when Mitsuya sort of goes dim, kind of signaling that maybe she recognizes him.
FF8 vibe to it at the end, if you've played that, where Renoa's staring off of Balam Garden, and you don't know where Squall is.
Yeah.
Similar.
So I kind of go along with that when it comes to why he mended Joshua. To your point, NSP, like the way I interpreted that was he never got to say goodbye to his brother originally when he thought he first died. He in fact during that scene, the sort of, I guess, Ultima controlled Ifrit, if I'm understanding it correctly, the enthralled sort of Ifrit jams his fist into Phoenix's chest and explodes him and seems to be sort of the death of him. And so there's also a little bit of a reflection of that moment because Joshua's hurt in the chest again. And so I thought I just saw it as Clive having a moment to sort of heal that, say goodbye to his brother properly, because he couldn't do that the first time, and he had to just live with that for 13 years until he met Joshua again. But yeah, so that was my interpretation, was that Clive lived on, Joshua died, Joshua finally got put to rest. I think there's maybe some support. Here's the thing about how there's enough evidence to kind of like spin it any way that you want, because you would think that Joshua wouldn't be able to sort of revive himself, have this last final rebirth, because he's given his power of the Phoenix seemingly more fully to Clive at the end when the wings sprout out with the coolest fucking visual. One of the coolest visuals in the game and in the series ever, when the sort of like wings sprout out from behind Clive and you see it within the sort of eyes of Joshua, like the reflection of it. So freaking cool. So it seems like he doesn't really have the power of the Phoenix to maybe come back again. And if anybody could bring him back, it would be Clive, and it doesn't seem like Clive does. Clive washes up on the beach alone. There's no sign of Joshua. So I don't know. My interpretation was pretty much at the end of the day, a lot like EyesOnBee's interpretation in terms of Clive living, Joshua finally being put to rest. I don't know about Dion. I think I'm in the same space. I think I'm like hopeful that Dion constantly has a death wish, almost like Clive does, earlier in the game. And he refuses to take the wyvern tail from Harpocrates, and I think just like the fates are gonna keep that motherfucker alive, even if he kind of wants to die or feels like he should die or whatever it is. I think he's probably gonna live even against his will to some degree, and sort of live on in a virtuous way, because he was probably one of the best characters in the entire game, just in terms of like having a real sort of moral center and real sense of ethics and agency. So yeah.
Fair. So just to answer the question individually, I changed my mind on it several times, and I changed my mind several times on it before the game was officially released. I mean, so because I got a chance to play a review copy, and so I was kind of alone with this a lot before I started looking to what other people interpreted things as, and my initial thought was that that Clive probably survived, and that Joshua didn't. And I don't know why, but I sort of recognized that was a little bit of a preference bias. And I was a completionist. I think that's the very subconsciously the fate that I thought I wanted for the characters. I didn't want Joshua to die because I'm like malicious, but because I just have this sort of uh, problem with characters being revived twice, and so there was like, hey, can that work? And the answer to whether anything can work is usually proven by the thing that makes it work for the first time. So I've got to kind of remove myself from labeling something as a trope, or I've got to determine why something specifically doesn't work within the context of its own release. As far as Dion goes, I'll just start with Dion because we all have. I think Dion died, and personally, I feel like that was the most thematically befitting and honorable thing they could have done for him as a gay male character in a Japanese game. Honorable death, honorable like sacrifice, like the idea of sacrificing oneself for the greater good is in Japanese culture an honor often reserved for heterosexual males. It's rare that they even allow women to do that. And there's honor suicide, but that is there's something about its depiction in media. And so to allow a gay male character the honor of that fate felt really genre breaking to me, more than it felt like, oh, we finally got a gay character and they killed him. That it felt like that more to me, based on the way that just the amount of love that they put into the creation of that character. That being said, no body, so like they could really do whatever. And I would like to see if I will admit I would love to see Bahamut DLC more than anything. If I'm being honest, I would love to see more of his life. I would love to play as Bahamut, that kind of stuff. So with Joshua and Clive, I am now, after I've now watched the ending. In preparation for this, I watched the ending 40 times. Just the end scene after the Ultima fight. And I just really wanted to like break down every frame and kind of decide the vibe that I got from it. And I am of the mind that Joshua survived, that Joshua was healed, that Clive made a decision when he realized that absorbing Ultima's powers was going to potentially take him, to use the last of that magic, which has like a Deus Ex Machina level of power. It's like you can point to the thing that says, well, the Phoenix can't bring it back. Ultima's power is absolutely however they want to write it. There's no limits, there's no structure to how that power can work. It's one of the few things that was not explained. So he has that power. He's got the power. So he's got the power of Ultima, and then the 8 icons. So his ability to resurrect may be there. We don't have conclusive answers about that. As far as Joshua as a historian, the last conversation you have with Harpocrates about Joshua, he says very clearly that Joshua has the makings of a good historian, like a real one. And when this journey is over, I expect him to be one. And you could say, oh, well, Clive took on that moniker, he was given a quill. And so they give you information to, and it's, again, he's a blue mage, he takes on other roles. It's not the first time he's taken on a different name, so that it could be a way of honoring him. I also am deeply entrenched with the religious elements of this, right? So Ultima is not just a representation of like God, like, hey, let's go kill a god, like they even say that in the game, but there's elements of the Ultima collective. So this idea that Elohim is kind of this collective consciousness, that there's one in many, is a concept that you can take from the Old Testament. The very first time that we hear the word God in Genesis, it's the Elohim is the Hebrew word that is used, and there's a whole historical context I'm not going to get into as to why that happened, but Elohim is plural. It's a word for God, but it's plural. And so there's this Elohim reference. Also, if you get into Gnosticism, there's a bunch of demiurge references that are really deep with Ultima and the Ultima collective. So there's this idea that he's this representative of this Old Testament demiurge, and that an emergent property of the creation is this icon that's out of the system. Like, if notice Phoenix is not in the Circle of Malleus mural. It's if you're like, oh no, he's that set of wings below Ifrit, he's not. It says clearly Phoenix is missing. Phoenix is an emergent property of human evolution. He is the only human icon. He's the only icon, or she, it's the only icon, or they, that's the only icon that does not fit within the Circle of Malleus. And so it's already rule breaking. And so, there's a lot to be said about the representative survival of that. Also, if you study what Joshua believes religiously, which is described in the Act of Time lore, he believes in the Rosarian faith of the founder. So he thanks the founder often. And if you understand what the founder is, it helps give some context to why it's valuable for him to physically live on and give this chronicler. But there's things like, hey, the final trophy is called the chronicler, and it's when you complete Final Fantasy mode. And so, oh, well, I'm Clive, so I must be the chronicler. I think the reason it's called the chronicler is, again, meta commentary, that we are the chronicler. Now we get to write the story as how it goes, but I interpreted it as the most thematically relevant to have Joshua actually survive. As far as Clive's fate, believe it or not, his fate is the least relevant to the way that I think the game gives mystery. I think he certainly thought he was going to die and made the choice to, with the last of his will, he chose to die in a way befitting of his memories with Joshua. Like when he has that emotional scene with Joshua where he's reliving the memories, they show Joshua as a baby. That's not about him grieving the loss of Joshua. That's about him grieving the loss of his life with Joshua. That's about him, choosing to be the first shield of Rosaria, and so I think that could be seen as him, making a choice to be that. I also am equally aware of the fact that he made all these promises, that Joshua asked him to stay alive. Joshua was the more willing one to die, and Joshua had less to fulfill for the people around him. So I can see either way for Clive, and I'm actually slightly leaning towards live for Joshua, or for Clive. I'd say 51-49 for Clive's survival, but I think Joshua survived, and I think that's the hottest take that I have. So okay, I think we've got going.
I just wanted to say one thing,
please,
because it kind of builds off of some of the words you said, and it's been the biggest inspiration this game put into me is I really want to play Xenogears again, just because a lot of the concepts, and I think those can be tied to Ultima, which I know you want to talk to, but I really genuinely thought it was going to go full Xenogears at certain points in the game, with the Akashic being used as spare parts. Ultima kind of feels like a demiurge, where they think they're a god and they create man, but they're not, and they're inherently imperfect and stuff. And it's just, it makes me want to play it again, because it feels like there's so many overlaps and parallels that like maybe I'll get some things a little bit more. And I don't know if you guys have played it, but it's a great game.
Yeah, I haven't played it yet personally, though I know it's beloved. Um, I'm curious about a question though, Baby Seal.
Yeah.
On the Circle of Malleus. So the Circle of Malleus, when you mentioned that, that's the big sort of mural, right?
That's
That
the
has
mural,
all the
yeah.
icons on it, right? And you said Phoenix isn't in it, and unless I was misinterpreting things, I thought that when Joshua sees the final, like, sort of unscathed version of it, and I forget exactly where, but he goes off on that little side quest,
Yeah.
and sees it, and they show him this, and when he comes back, he sort of it seems to like give him this information that like him and Clive can sort of combine, because it seemed like the wings of the Phoenix were coming off of the Ifrit, right? In that, or am
Yeah.
I misinterpreting it? The wings
Well,
wasn't that where the Phoenix was in the Circle of Malleus? It was like as the wings of Ifrit risen?
so Ifrit Risen is independent from Ultima Awakened, and if you compare the two, they do look different. The wings on Ultima Awakened actually more resemble the other icons. There's 6 wings too, so it is a confusing distinction between the two. But what is different about Ifrit Risen than Ultima Awakened is in fact the Phoenix. So he sort of took the lost Leviathan's role in the Circle of Eight. There's always 8, and that's kind of a natural thing that happened to the Circle. We still are missing context on that, which again, these are the kind of intentional mysteries that have like this DLC shaped hole in them that I feel is like an appropriate hole, right? Like, because all the major stuff was answered, but like, hey, I want more of this. What's a good thing that you can do? I think solving that hole is it. But there is a distinction, a meaningful, that was described, I mean, more in the ATL than maybe visually, between Ifrit Risen and Ultima Awakened. So yeah. Do you have any thoughts to add, Brian, before we move on to Ultima as a topic?
No, actually, that's what I want to dive into, if anything.
Okay.
I did have one thing, because I don't know if it fits into this next topic or the one we were just talking about. Because I was reading through everything yesterday in the Harpocrates sort of lore stuff, and I started to Google it myself, but then I was like, you know what? I'm just Baby Seal is like a credentialed in this stuff and can probably answer it a lot better. The sort of like definition of mythos versus logos. I'm like curious, because I know it's like a Greek mythology thing. I think it's Greek mythology. Just like the significance of that, and if there's more to sort of mine from that than maybe the average player who doesn't know that background would take away from it.
So it's really just, so it's more of a logos in particular is a Greek philosophy thing, and so it's really myth versus, not to be too reductive, logic. So logos in particular was like a Socratic method of convincing somebody, and so the distinction between them is fantasy versus fact, right? And so that that the death of Mythos was the death of fantasy, and the evolution to logos being treated as the corruption of fantasy, has to do with original sin. So the idea that knowledge of the forbidden tree, like humanity getting the choice to learn, the knowledge of good and evil is a sin, is described in the active time lore. It's actually described, there's an entry for original sin, and it is quite specifically what Ultima calls humanity's choice to have choice, so to speak. So it's the evolution from fantasy to agency.
Yeah, and he calls Clive corrupted because of
Right.
his will. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So, okay. Let's dig into Ultima. Now, Ultima as a villain is it was definitely a choice. There is one of the most Final Fantasy things that you can do is kill a god in a game, and so there are criticisms that Ultima came across as flat, ineffective, and tropey. And I can understand why somebody would say that based on this. Also, you look at the team, Creative Business Unit 3, and they have made some incredibly compelling antagonists. And I would like to hear your takes on how was the antagonist in this game? How was Ultima, the collective, effective? Was it necessary? Do stories need villains? And I'd like to get all of your takes on that. And I want to hear from Ryan. I know he has a lot to say on this.
Indeed, I do. It's interesting, right? Because we want a human villain at the end of these types of stories. Like, we desperately want there to be a person that we can fight and feel good about it, right? And that alone is kind of interesting. There's something in us that wants there to be a human obstacle that we have to overcome, in order to, I guess, bring light and life into the world. Unfortunately, things aren't always like that, and we don't always have like a specific face to a lot of the issues that we face in life. Although we would love to have a face to all those issues. It's also kind of a technique, really, that like even like politicians use, right? Like, we need to, be mad at this group of people, because now the thing that people are upset about has like an image, it has a face, it has, something that you could target and say that is like the source of your problems, right? And there is something very human about that, right? However, Ultima is kind of interesting because Ultima is not necessarily evil. He is an collective that is seeking it to perpetuate its survival, like all creatures, right? And there's a really interesting line that Clive says that stood out to me, where it's like, if our sin is survival, then you're marked by it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of encapsulates the entire thing, right? Is that like, Ultima is angry at humanity for wanting to survive, but his entire plot that he's been doing all these years himself is trying to survive, is the perpetuation of like his own survival. And so in that sense, is anything that Ultima is actually doing necessarily evil? Well, he could have chose to have given up magic, right? But human beings also could have chose to give up magic. And it's almost like to say that the same arrogance in man is also within God, right? So that's also kind of an interesting statement as well. So I do think that, whenever you have something like Ultima in a story, I do think it makes it really hard for someone to grasp what's being said thematically as easily as they would from a Sephiroth or an Immitselk, right? And usually it's not that those characters too don't have the same, higher level thematic stuff that you can spend a lifetime, kind of peeling through and being like, wow, that's really genius, right? But I think that a lot of people aren't even going to think that deep. And for a lot of people, it is easier just to say, that person with that face is the source of my issues,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore we had to kill them. And there's a certain like gratifying feeling in that. Whereas with Ultima, he doesn't really give you that. He represents something rather inside of us that we're defeating. And that is really hard for people to to kind of feel the same sense of satisfaction from when it's not given like a very specific human face and identity, I feel.
I agree. And that's a great breakdown. EyesOnBee.
So Ultima, when I met them, I instantly wondered if their history would be similar to the path of the Ascians of FF14, where you're led to believe they're evil. And I had instantly wondered of what their reason was, and if the writers would make it something that we would sympathize with. And definitely there wasn't any sympathy for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the end, it's much like what Ryan said, where Ultima at its core is just trying to survive. I think for me, though, I see a lot of parallels in this to FF12's Vana, whose goal is often kind of missed by many, because it's more of a gray area rather than black and white. And that's what's always really intrigued me about 12's story. Vana's goal is essentially to free humanity from the Akuria's influence and hold, just to kind of like cleanse the world of the way things are going now.
Right.
And I think Ultima and Vana as villains are going to forever be in the place of a lot of people that's just going to go right over their head.
100%. 100%.
That's what I really got on it so far.
Yeah.
Because I'm still trying to piece it together.
Yeah.
It also kind of doesn't help, and I feel like, you know, the writers kind of are at fault for this. It also doesn't help that they use a lot of tropey language at times,
right,
in order to communicate what I think is a lot deeper than like what the surface level dialogue can sometimes communicate. You know, they'll be like, "Let's go kill God," like this, basically, like flat out. Where I think that they should have emphasized a little bit more that Ultima is not a divine being, really, of any sort. It's an interdimensional, like, alien zombie thing. You know, it's not. It created humanity, so in that sense, it's a god. But it's not actually like the divine one true god type of trope. It is literally like we were made by like an alien that can synthesize life forms. So I think actually emphasizing that would have probably helped distinguish Ultima a little bit more from like the just kill God trope.
Fair enough. Subtext.
Yeah, I think, I think a lot of my feelings are very similar to Ryan's in terms of like, just, I personally had no problem with it. I actually really liked it, right? Like I remember early on, I was struggling a little bit with the sort of, I guess, the antagonistic center of the story or lack thereof or something. It's funny thinking back on like that first third of the game. It's so much more hazy than my memory of the latter half of the game. But I kept it, like, a lot of it made sense, right? Like there were all these parallel, people kept making all these comparisons to Game of Thrones, and understandably so, especially with the prologue, which feels very Game of Thrones inspired in a lot of ways. Even just like the visuals of the of Elwyn, coming back and returning to the kingdom, and like you get heaven, like how they line up. I mean, that's episode 1 of Game of Thrones, straight up. So I understood why people took it to that place. And while I thought the politics were fairly interesting, they weren't really grabbing me. Like, it didn't feel like there was something within that I was really rallying against. Like Annabella obviously wanted to find her and sort of get justice for Joshua and whatnot, but I didn't really know what I was like pushing toward, I guess, for quite a while, until then the sort of plan about the crystals came back, which was brought up, which was, interestingly enough, I had forgotten, because I know it's on the back of the box, and it's like, I think it's in the back of the box, and I know it's in like the GameSpot like description of like the game's sort of like literally in the order page, like about FF16, you go on a mission to destroy the mother crystals, and that doesn't happen until like probably didn't happen until about like hour 15 or so, or even further into the game that like I reached that point, and it's like kind of the primary mission of the game and the thing that you're doing. It takes you a while to get there because you have to sort of reconcile, Clive's, feelings about himself in the past and discovering Ifrit and his role in at Phoenix Gate and all of that. So like I found myself sort of drifting through the story a little bit early on, and then when I got to Ultima, like that was where it was like I just found it interesting. Like the weirdness of it just sort of compelled me even more than the sort of politics and the sort of Game of Thrones kind of, chess moving that was happening early on in the game. So when Ultima came in, it was this really fascinating, like, oh shit, okay, we're getting into some weird stuff. I don't know how it's gonna play out. I don't know if I'm gonna like it or not. But I think there's so much thematic payoff to Ultima and all the things that NSP was talking about in terms of, I loved how Clive challenged Ultima with like that thought of, you say that, this desire that we have and the way that we use magic and sort of our will is this sort of like sin, yet like you're marked by it too because you put this on us. You know what I mean? You created your own sort of like the blight and everything that happens to your civilization was because you did all the same things. It's like how is it, bad for us that are we not like born from you, and so wouldn't we also have the same flaws? I think there was like an interesting sort of psychological debate going on between Clive and Ultima and sort of their philosophies on everything, because Ultima just wanted things to go his way, but so he's not like a traditional villain, I guess, because it's not a particular character and particular person. He doesn't have backstory with Clive necessarily, although he was there at Phoenix Gate and that's the implication. He like sort of was chess piecing all that stuff that ruined Clive's life. So I really enjoyed Ultima as a villain, like if that's kind of the question. I really thought there was something fascinating to think about. I think it gets I can understand people being or having flashbacks to, maybe I haven't played Kingdom Hearts, but I've seen enough clips of cutscenes and stuff to like see how they can maybe put it into like sounding, because I think to Ryan's point of like at points it sounds tropey, right? Like let's go kill God, and then it's like you and your will, you know what I mean? It's like you start talking about these bigger concepts like will and whatnot, and it gets very heady, it gets very philosophical, but there isn't, and that can kind of go over people's heads or be a little too obtuse, and then you're like, what are we really talking about? I felt that way a little bit with like Barnabas's sort of preaching, and I understand that he's kind of a zealot and that's sort of like his thing, is that he's really just sort of bought into everything. But I also struggled a little bit to find what is driving you as an individual human being. I know you're really into this, and I know you really believe in sort of the plan and how ultimately is using you, but like why? And I've been wanting to replay the game and like get back to that point of the game to really understand even Barnabas better, because I think he's so instrumental to what Ultima was planning. But I can see how people can feel a little like it jumps around a little bit, because you do go from villain to villain, and Ultima is sort of hanging over it all the time. So I can understand how people may have struggles getting to feeling that way about Ultima they feel about some of the other villains in the game, in the series at least.
Okay, so I loved Ultima as a construct. I was a very early adopter to the visuals, and the just the creepiness and eeriness of the design and the appearance, the no eyelids thing. Like just from a presentational standpoint, early on I really liked that. I think Harry Lloyd, the performer, plays Viserys Targaryen. Kind of a fan of his too, so it was neat to see that come out. But as the game went on and I was watching it being presented, I was like, okay, we're getting into some trouble here a little bit, with how this looks. And it was right around when we look at Zemeckis Falls, we're right at Tabor. I'm like, okay, the concept is a little vacuous. We have these undying here, and I could benefit from explanation, and so we get this big info dump, and it kind of clicked for me what this was. The info dump is right after we destroy the last Mother Crystal. We go on what I think is the best scene in the game. Not most emotional, but just coolest. Like we're in this interdimensional rift, and we're kind of seeing how the Ultima Collective operated, like the grand plan. We're not seeing every bit of it. It's just an outline of the plan, enough to drive people that are just passively trying to get to the icon fights. Enough information to kind of feel satisfied that they're fighting a big bad. But if you look at it deeply, and look at the active time lore, stuff like that, Ultima is a deconstruction of the need for antagonists and stories. And a lot of I'm not trying to say adult in a derogatory fashion or in a condescending fashion. A lot of my favorite adult stories don't actually have antagonists. Like who's the bad guy in The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2? Don't at me, people. I know not everybody liked all of those games, but it's there's not just this face. There's bad people. There's whatever. A lot of the best stories, I don't need bad guys, because a lot of our stories that we live in our life that are interesting are not driven by an antagonist. And so we are, and Ryan touched on this for sure, but there is this need in stories to structure them around this bad guy, this face of all of your problems. And what we learn about Ultima Collective is that Ultima Collective is a reflection of a less evolved, self-centered version of ourselves, right? And that's generally the point of Kill God stories. Of every JRPG that's tried to do this, they've tried to do this to tell a story about how humanity overcomes itself, not how we defeat the bad guys. This is the first time that's done so effectively that I felt satisfied by that story. This is the first time the quote-unquote Kill God Final Fantasy JRPG story actually resonated thematically for me, because that's what we as a species need to do to heal our planet. That's what we need to do to overcome these oppressive, selfless forces that are keeping us down, that are keeping us as a species back. Is we take a look inward. How are we being selfish? How are we being so survival oriented and rejecting the other? The very the power of friendship being kind of like this tropey, power of friendship is why I won, being Final Fantasy. It is overused, but it's also Final Fantasy. And so in order to effectively tell that story, doing everything possible to connect us to the characters and let us see ourselves in these characters. And most of these characters are not just defined by the events that make them. And that's something that I see with a lot of kind of serialized dramas and anime and shonen and seinen. It's they're defined by what happens to them. That's not really how any of the characters are defined in Final Fantasy XVI. They're all defined by the interactions that they have with the other people. And we're given tons of interactions with, we see so many shades of Clive And Clive's kind of a normal guy. Like, he's got gruff stuff, but he has the full range of emotions in how he interacts with other people. And it's not really about what happens to him, although it's important to know what happens to him. Like, he was anti-slavery before he was a slave. Like, this is not a story about him learning slavery is bad. Anybody that says that has taken an incredibly reductive look at the story. He knew, his father knew. Like, the entire kingdom of Rosaria was an attempt to break the rest of the geopolitical structure, but they had to do it within the confines of the geopolitical structure. The founder is a representation of man's work, not magic's work. The founder is a story of building a house, learning how to build a house with stones. So when Joshua thanks the founder, it's a call to that. Like, it's a call to humanity. And they're a representation of the evolution of what made them, you know. And so to me, the defeat of Ultima is a really, really comprehensive and clear adult deconstruction of the villain narrative, and instead gives us an opportunity to look inward and say, where are we being self-centered? Where are we fearful? Because he's also afraid, you know. So it's a reduction of fear, self-centeredness, and instead embracing love and other-centeredness and the courage that those things take, admitting when we're at fault. You know, those are the ways that we as a species solve like the very real problems that we have that are mirrored super clearly in these in the struggles that everybody goes through. So Ultima for me was not the kind of villain that you know, I generally like when I want to like a bad guy, you know, when I want to, oh, that's a compelling character. Like, it's not an Emmett Selk, it's not a Sephiroth, it's, you know, it's a deconstruction of the villain. It's a deconstruction of the need for an antagonist in a story, and it's what we as a species need to start doing to solve these problems. It's not looking at people as good guys and bad guys, you know, and instead looking at the reality of what are we doing, you know, to make things better. Not fighting the bad guys. That's a scapegoat. That's a shortcut. We need to improve our circle. We need to improve our ground. And so this effectively turned the villain archetype on its head and instead made it a journey of self-progress. And I think it did so really, really well. But, you know, are there things that they could have done that would have made that maybe hit a broader audience? I think that when you get to Zemeckis Falls, if they had just shown a cutscene explaining what the children of Zemeckis were, what happened to that mother crystal, why Ultima destroyed it, explained that there was this whole fallen civilization that, you know, tried to defy Ultima, and then Ultima destroyed that crystal as sort of a middle finger, you know, to the power structure. You know, everything kind of fell apart after that. And then as an emergence from that, this cult formed in worship of Ultima, built entirely around fear-based faith, you know, which this makes a criticism of. And from those, that's where Barnabas's mother comes from. That's why Barnabas, who is several hundred years old, by the way, in case you didn't catch that, has, yeah.
I knew he defied his age because
Yeah.
there was conversation of like how he hasn't aged in like
Right.
decades. I think it's like even in an NPC like side thing as you're walking through some town, somebody mentions it. And
Yeah.
it's in the active time lore too, but
Yeah, and in the map scenes when they're explaining stuff. But so Barnabas represents this old, you know, call to these fear-based religions and these fear-based faiths, fear-based faiths. And so Barnabas is compelling as somebody that just genuinely believes that he's doing the right thing because he has this generational fear of this being that absolutely took any hope of agency away from them. It was so overwhelmingly more powerful that fear and that trauma generationally applied to his mother, who he loved and looked up to. And when he was born the dominant of Odin, he kept on with that zealotry and has been yanking levers and pulling chains for generations up to this point, which generally created the geopolitical structure that we see in Valisthea as of the 800s. So it's a result of that fear-based faith. But this game also makes very clear notations of good faith, right? Like good types of faith, like this founder religion that the Rosarians believe in, even the Crystalline Dominion's faith about Griegor, as there's some positivity that holds on to people that are descendants of that faith. And Jill expresses faith. The last thing that she says is, "I believe in you. I have faith in you, Clive." Right? So there's all these distinctions that are really meaningful about how faith is not always bad. That there's nuance to these things. And that's something that's been kind of generally lacking from this story when told in other Final Fantasies. So I was a big fan of it. And I know that I went on really, really long about that.
And by other Final Fantasies, he wants to say 10, but he won't say it.
I was clapping in my head as you were talking, just so you know, because you've also had the benefit of like sitting with this game for so much longer and like replaying it. I've only started my new game plus and just got to Benedicta sort of for the first time, and in replaying it, and I've only replayed a few hours so far. There's the funny thing about this entire game, I think in a lot of ways, is like, unlike a lot of Final Fantasies, and I think this was like holding it back for me early on, was like when you reach the end of it, it really is like expected, but like effective, right? Like there's not a lot of like tremendously surprising things that happen in the story, right? Like there are mysteries and there are things that you sort of unpack, but from moment to moment, beat to beat, like probably the most surprising thing was Bahamut sort of seemingly losing control and attacking the city, and because they kind of dropped that on you in a way that I loved too, because the last time you saw Dion, it seems like he's kind of following the plan. He has a little bit of a back and forth with Joshua, but ultimately seems to be game for like taking on his father and whatnot. And then suddenly you see him like completely out of control, and you're like, what happened, right? And then they fill that in later on with the cutscene where they show him sort of becoming enthralled by what's the name of the kid who's ultimately Ultima?
Olivier,
yeah. So like, but ultimately though, like, all throughout the game, there's, for the most part, like nothing completely shocked me. There wasn't any live stream sequence moments or anything that really kind of, oh my god, I didn't see that coming,
right?
And at first, like I think I was looking for that or waiting for that. And as I just lived more in the world and let the story sort of play out, and the characters sort of become all their characters, and the NPCs get all that depth that they get in the side quests, which I criticize heavily at the very beginning of the game. And I think there are still fair criticisms of like some of the way the mechanics within side quests work, but like ultimately when people say that there's really good lore and really good stories and character moments in those side quests, they're totally true. And there's so much richness and depth. Like the world felt a little flat for me at the very beginning, right? Like you go into a town, you can maybe go into, you talk to a merchant, walk into like one building, but there's not a tremendous amount of exploration. There doesn't seem to be a lot of incentive to exploring the open sort of landscape, because you might pick up some bloody hides or something. It's like, what am I doing? But as I spent more time, when I reached like hour 80 something, and I was, finishing hunts and doing these final side quests and whatnot, there was just so much richness to it. And even now, like I said, when I started Soul Spiel, like starting my new game plus run, I'm seeing so many more layers than I saw the first time, you know? And I think that this is a game that benefits from going back and replaying and seeing the story play out again, because I think there's a lot more depth to be mined from the characters and the lore, and really understanding. I didn't, you know, I understood some of the stuff that happened between the Fallen and Ultima and the Children of Zemeckis and all that, but even hearing you sort of explain it more, I'm like, oh god, there's so I gotta get to that part of the game again in my new game plus run, so I can sort of understand it better, or like feel it even more, you know.
I just want to add on to the fact you had said there's no real there wasn't a real live stream moment for you, you know, anything like shocking. And I agree with that to a point, but I would say I still, and I mentioned this in chat earlier, I think one of the most standout moments in the game was that first Mother Crystal and the reveal of Ultima and just everything that happens there. That was the moment that I stopped everything and I said, everybody in my chat who, if you have to say this isn't a Final Fantasy game, this is a final. There's just something about it, and I can't nail what it is, but I feel like that's always going to be the most memorable point of the game for me.
Well, that's a good scene. It's a good scene too, because it relates to Sid too, and like, you know, the passing of the mantle, and you know, one thing that I see mentioned in relation to that is, why are we destroying the mother crystals? Is that explained? And the primary reason that we are is, there is some, we've been manipulated a little bit to destroying them as a group, but the reason is because Sid, who has this mission, ultimately has this unknowing wisdom, and that's described in Active Time lore about Ramuh, is that the dominants of Ramuh have like an unspoken knowledge about how things are, which in addition to his interactions with Barnabas, probably explains why he's got a little bit more of a idea what Ultima's up to. So I think there is a little bit of a mental chess match that's happening with Sid and the Mother Crystals. Even though the Mother Crystals were part of Ultima's final plan, they still did have to go for humanity to win as well. So I have seen that in chat. Yeah.
It begs the question, because in that scene he says to Ultima, I know who you are. Mm-hmm. And I always wondered, like, okay, how was that? And that's one of those things I really want to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and there was so much story, you can't answer everything, but this game does try, you know, it really does try. And so when it doesn't, it's usually meaningful, you know. So do you have anything to add, Ryan, before we start taking audience questions?
I guess my only question would be what everyone thought of Media, right?
I thought it was going to be more, and I'm still trying to.
Yeah, I'm still kind of curious on Media. Now, if I had to go full tinfoil hat here, I would say that Media was Media is actually where Ultima is from, and that was the purpose of when you actually defeat, when you actually destroy Origin, Media also seems to disappear as well, which kind of suggests that Media is where, that distant star that they're from is actually Media, right? And it would also actually create a deeper theme, or around the moon gazing, right? Not just the song, but why it's emphasized so much and why it's shown, and then preying on Media and all these other things. Is that my assumption is that while it's not explicitly said, it is meant for you to infer that Ultima is from Media.
Yeah, I mean that was pretty much my thought. I thought it had something to do with the Fallen too, potentially. At least early on in the game, right? Before there's really the introduction of the Fallen, you do know there's this sort of ancient civilization, and it was crazy advanced. And it seemed like they had the ability to, well, they definitely had the ability to fly. so they may have gotten to the ability to also leave the planet. I don't know. So that was my initial sort of read on it, and where I thought the Metzia thing sort of worked into it. I haven't really resolved it too much in my own head, but I think what you said makes a lot of sense. I do think it probably had to relate to Ultima in some way by the end of the game, but I didn't know exactly how. I read a pretty crazy tinfoil hat, speaking of tinfoil hat things, on Reddit. Where it was like a conversation about Media and like why did it dim and whatnot. And one of the theories that I personally just don't like, because it feels a little too, I don't know, like, just it's like it's just a little convenient, or like storybook or something, is that it's someone thought that when it faded, it was sort of answering Jill's wish to it by reviving Clive.
When I wish upon a star.
Yeah. But I'm like, wow, so Media existed solely for this wish to be granted. Okay. I don't think they would do something that sort of contrived, but like, I think it's cool that it wasn't necessarily answered, but I kind of want, like, of the things I want answers about, even more than Leviathan in some ways, I kind of want to know about Metzia, more specifically. I don't know. There's just the visual of it is so arresting. Just like this bright red thing near the moon.
Right.
I don't think I need answers, but it would just be cool to know a little more.
And it's in so many scenes too.
Right.
Yeah.
It's introduced super early. Super early.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the demo has it, yeah.
Right. And I mean, there's always the frame of Clive and Jill gazing at the moon. So they want you to see Media. Like, I always thought, like, okay, the whole point is that you need to look at Media, because Media is going to be so big. Don't just ignore that little red spot next to the moon. It's like, it's something else.
Maybe that
I thought
was
we were gonna like travel to Media somehow, some way, at some point.
Go full Inwalker. Yeah.
Yeah. That would have been too predictable. Maybe it was something to do with their tie to each other too.
Yeah, or I would have thought that like icons were from Media or something like that,
Yeah.
like going into it.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not specifically answered. Doing some algebra on it, like Media disappears when, two notable things happen, and that's that the Ultima dies, and when magic leaves the world. So is Media some universal force that allows for magic to exist? Because Ultima Civilization also found out how to use magic. Magic seemingly predates the Ultima Collective. They didn't invent magic. The fact that it's fixed next to the moon is irritating from an astrophysical point of view, but like, I don't know, maybe they didn't give a shit, when they were designing it. I mean, it indicates that it's got some fixed orbit with the moon. I don't know how, I mean, we don't even know how the sun works in this world, but so there is its relationship to the moon does make you think maybe there's something on the moon that's holding it. Maybe it is the some satellite link with the collective's origin source, like some kind of wormhole or something like that. It doesn't super matter. I think its symbolic purpose was to describe the magic had gone from the world, even more so than Ultima. And so yeah, that's what I think about it. But it's obviously like one of those cool questions that Ultimania or DLC could benefit from answering for us lore people.
Yeah. I have there's one more other thing that still that I'm trying to make sense of, and I'm sure it's out there, but I couldn't make sense of it.
Sure.
And that is the identity of the first hooded man, and why it showed up, and why it looked exactly like the hooded person that's also Joshua later on. That was something that I feel like I missed entirely with why that was the thing.
So the hooded man that Clive sees at Phoenix Gate. That's Ultima, right? Like
Right.
he's seeing Ultima showing him
Right.
something. Very
Yeah.
convenient that he ends up looking just like Joshua when Joshua's
Right.
traveling later.
Which is what like
I thought at
I don't
certain
get.
points,
Yeah.
at certain points, it looks like underneath that model is like the teenage version of Clive, because I always interpreted it as like not like a dark Clive, but like something along those lines. This
Shadow
is some,
self. Right.
And that is sort of what happens, right? Like when you go to that first fallen relic, when you go into the apothecary, right? That's what it is. You you kind of confront yourself and press L3 and R3 to accept the truth. He takes off the hood and it's Clive. So I think that's definitely an accurate thing. It is just weird that it just so happens that when Joshua is running around the world 13 years later, he looks like that. I also, like, from a personal just like nitpick point of view, or I don't know, I'm just curious what do you all think of this? I would have preferred if they kept Joshua's identity like when he's alive. I just struggle with a lot of the showing of Joshua before the confrontation with Ultima at the Mother Crystal, because it from a personal preference point of view, I would have just liked if that was sort of a reveal, and if we never, if even I think Clive accepting his truth for me would have been even more impactful if they hadn't already established that no, there is someone out there who is a dominant there is somebody who Benedicta was talking to. There is somebody who is sort of at the place where you fight Benedicta. They show him multiple times, both hooded and then unhooded, before he shows up. It would have been cool for me personally, my personal preference, if like in that moment when Ultima arrives and messes you up, if Joshua does show up and it's like you had accepted the truth yourself, you had thought you were the one who did everything, and suddenly Joshua shows up and it's like, wow, he is alive, and it would have given me that little moment that I wanted in the story of like, oh my god.
Before
if it was more of a reveal.
Before I answer that is a good question. I do want to respond to the hood thing. So the hood thing, there is probably, like, just looking at it, the actual outfit probably has lore significance, because remember, Joshua became part of the Undying because Yote from the secret cult of the Undying did save Joshua, and Joshua was traveling with the Undying for years, so he was working with the Undying. So I think that is probably a uniform specifically designed for that role. And I feel like maybe Ultima has been watching the Undying, because the Undying posed a secret threat to the children of Zemeckis for a while. They've kind of worked in secret in sort of a co-contrary fashion. So I think that robe represents some kind of rank. And I think that there probably is a story that was designed there that we were just never shown regarding that. Like, he was, like, Ultima appeared as that thing because he knew that the Undying existed. He knew that they were an enemy. How do you have, as a chain puller and yank lever guy trying to get his way, how do you manipulate, how do you gaslight Clive? And it's, using symbols like that, using the symbols of your enemy. I think it's somewhere in that ballpark is probably like the intended answer, but is there a canonical answer? Not that I'm aware of, to that. As far as the reveal of Joshua, I was extremely relieved that they got it out of the way immediately. And I think that it was really, like, there was something super powerful about Joshua and Clive first meeting as icons, because it took a ton of like expositional garbage out of the way, because you immediately know that they know who each other is. Like, you don't have to, look, well, I didn't mean to kill you, blah, blah, blah. Like, everybody knows all that stuff, so that when they do meet each other in person, Like it was just after the battle, after in front of their mother, like what a way to meet. I think it added a lot of weight to that. And also I don't think like mystery, like you said, was the big narrative draw of this game.
I think my bigger issue with it is, and I may feel differently when I play it the second time, but it felt like for me it undercut the moment where Clive accepted the truth, because they established that there is a second. He is chasing something real. That real thing was being interrogated by Benedicta. That real thing was showed up in multiple places. So like when Clive has that realization that like, oh, it was me who killed
I got
Joshua,
what you're saying. Yeah.
It felt undercut because I'm like, no, you've already established that there is something. It's not just internal.
Right.
So
I
for
think,
me, that's where it sort of missed.
I think if we didn't know that, but going into it, if we didn't know that there actually was something real, that there really was a Joshua that was being, chased, then the reveal of a second hooded person named Joshua that was alive, and not Clive, would have felt more Kingdom Heartsy. It would have felt like, oh, they just retconned what we saw. Like it would have felt too like contrived. Oh, they just decided he's alive halfway through the story.
I'll also say in naming him Margrace, I really feel like there was no attempt in trying to make it a secret.
Right.
Because Margrace is straight up a reference back to 12. Alcid Margrace is the prince of Rosaria.
Yeah.
And
with the
so,
Z,
like,
but
yeah. So I mean it's a direct reference back to that. And so as soon as I heard Margrace, I was like, oh, that's Joshua. Like, no doubt in my mind. And not everybody's gonna get that, but that's why I've just been like, I'm glad they showed it early. I think it still also adds to that conflict, because it's beautiful to see that Clive accepts the truth. Yeah. And then he still gets to, like, I don't think it would have hit the same if he hadn't accepted it. I think that he needed to accept it before seeing Joshua, because I don't know, for me it felt like there was more of an emotional payoff.
Yeah, no, I think when he accepts the truth is perfect. I remember DMing Baby Seal when I reached that point of like him accepting the truth. I was like, oh, I'm glad they just got that. They that wasn't a long mystery they held for a long time. I had one question though, before I'm like jumping ahead of the chat in some ways. I don't know if you asked this, but it's a Joshua related question. I think it's fairly quick. I'm just curious because I haven't been able to come up with a good answer in my head. Why do you think Joshua avoided meeting Clive so much? Because he sees Clive and Jill outside of the potted tree when they exit it, and he's like, the hour has gotten late, and goes away. I'm just curious why he seemed to avoid contacting Clive through all those years, or even after discovering it.
Yeah, I still have that question myself too.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems like intentionally not answered. This seems like one of the DLC ones. Like, this is one of those DLC shaped gaps for me. Where I was like, oh, okay, they left this unintentionally or intentionally unanswered. So I don't, and I'm not super fond of stuff like that. Just in general, I don't like a fully told story and then they remove stuff so that they can monetize it later. It's not my favorite thing to do, but it does feel like that's what was done here. I could be wrong, and I hope but hey, it doesn't mean I won't be in line to play it.
I got an initial vibe from the Undying as sinister in some kind of way too, which isn't what it is, but I guess again that ties back to 12. Final boss is called the Undying.
Mm-hmm.
Everything ties back to 12. I'm not even kidding about
I mean, yeah, with CPU 3 always ties back to 12. Yeah.
But I automatically assumed there was probably sinister reasoning behind it, and then it turned out that like they're fine. They're cool.
Well, there were shades of gray that I think were interesting that were played with when it came to that, because you had Clive says as much, says that he's sort of like you sort of surround yourself with interesting, people. He tells to Joshua about the Undying. He kind of has like a little bit of a questionable sort of, he also has like slight weird vibes with them. And then later on there's that side quest. I think it's a side quest where you one of the Undying goes to some like religious thing that's
you go
happening.
to Ash.
Yeah, you go to Ash, and then then he sort of wants those people to continue with their zealotry because he sort of identifies with it in some way. And there's like some weird sort of just gray area with that I really appreciated. I really liked that there's a lot of there's cuts of like that are both good and bad about some of the ways you can interpret some of the things, including even there's when you're talking about the ending again with the book that Joshua writes, there's also that book about the history of the bearers that's also on the side quest. That it's like that the executors are keeping covered up, and they sort of there's a moral question about whether it's good for that knowledge to be out in the world or not and whatnot. So and how history is passed on and how it's guarded, how it's shared. So I think there's a lot of interesting things. The game throws a lot of thoughts at you and lets you think about a lot of thoughts and a lot of these themes and topics. And I think that's where the ambiguity is, right? Because it doesn't give you a full answer on a lot of them. And I like that personally.
Right on. So guys, we're switching over to audience questions, and the audience questions I will pick from a list here, and they will be included in the YouTube video when this gets uploaded, just FYI. So I'm going to start, and if you guys in the audience, by the way, want to ask questions of specific creators, feel free to do so too, but just highlight the message and or at me, because I'm the one that can see I'm the one that's asking the questions and I need to see it highlighted. So Starfire Ever, Starfire VR, I'm sorry. If they make another sequel for Final Fantasy XVI, then they're going to have to make new icons. And then how would that work? What is you guys' theory when it comes to that part? Personally, I don't think we're ever going to see a sequel. I think we would just see like stories within the world that Valisthea is on. And so I don't know if they'll ever make any new icons. I think they might just explore, parts of the story that explain what the icons actually are and how they emerge through the evolution of humanity, and obviously Leviathan. What are you guys' thoughts?
I'm in the same boat. I originally wanted to see more icons, but now I actually want to know more about the prior icons that appeared before the ones that we've met. Like, we hear referenced often different versions of Shiva. And I do think, because somebody had mentioned in chat, the thing off the coast of, like, near Oriflamme, that mysterious crystal-y thing.
Yeah.
One of my theories is that that's something that Shiva may have froze. But the geography there is kind of a hot mess in a lot of ways, so it's really really hard to interpret. But I really would like to see that. But there's plenty of summons icons through Final Fantasy history that I think they could do stuff with if they needed to.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's an implication too that, like, that Griagor was a dominant of Bahamut, maybe the first one. And so she being a, I wonder if we see the first Shiva that's actually male, like its mythological namesake. Shiva is a male Hindu god, so that would be interesting to see. And so there's certainly stuff that you could talk to about there. There's also, like, just straight up what happened to Leviathan. I also have wondered about that crystal. I think you and I have talked about it, and also the you take a look at that crystal and where it is on the coast, and then you look at the map that's like literally available to you, and the geography of the coast straight up doesn't match, and that's an irritant to me. But what are you gonna do? I think that could be like the remnant. I think that's, I'm leaning towards that's the remnants of a crystal whose heart has moved, because we learned through the active time lore that there's another continent that isn't in the twins, and Moss the Chronicler talks about it, and it does seem to be remnants of the fallen civilization. So the people that are not the children of Zemeckis, like the last survivors of the annihilation of the Zemeckis mother crystal. So maybe they took the mother crystal with them, which would explain why that crystal hasn't dissolved, and we do see crystals reshape and stuff for Origin. So there's fun stuff there. What do you guys think? What do you guys want to see?
Okay, so here's the Final Fantasy 16 2 idea.
All right.
It's that Clive somehow washes to the shores of a new place. We'll just call it Doma.
Dude.
Oh.
And here he has to become Clive becomes a samurai, and he becomes a samurai, and there's brand new, like maybe more Asian themed, like specifically summons, right? So you'll have like Yojimbo and stuff, and it'd be awesome. That's Final Fantasy 16 too. Final Fantasy 16 Stormblood. That is my call for 16. No, for real. I don't think I don't think we'll ever see a sequel to this game. And furthermore, I actually don't even think we'll really see any more of Valisthea other than in 14, because I think that we're going to get like some type of Valisthea like raid series that is going to more properly explore a lot of the stuff. But in terms of like actually like, proper Final Fantasy 16 2 or any other game set in Valisthea, I don't think so. I think it'll just be something that is strictly limited to 14.
Do you think we'll just get no DLC?
We will get DLC.
Okay,
I do think it'll explore something. Oh, what do I think the DLC?
Do you think the DLC will explore? Do you think DLC will just skip Valisthea and go to that other continent? Maybe tell a story completely detached from these characters?
I don't think it'd be completely detached, but I do think it'll be something in that other continent.
Interesting.
And it will connect back to this story here. But then that's also something interesting too, is that, this whole story takes place on this one continent. Right? I mean,
right.
Yeah, right, two continents, right? The twins. And so it's kind of like, what is going on in the rest of this world? How are they using magic? Are there mother crystals there?
Right. Is the blight there?
There's so many questions about the broader world of Final Fantasy 16. And so while we're knee deep in FF Europe, I guess what I would like to see is like what's going on in like everywhere else in the world. And I think that other continent that we can see kind of like is an opportunity to say like, okay, this is going to give you a small glimpse of like what's happening on a continent that's not part of Valisthea, to give you an idea of what the rest of the world might be doing, during all this time where we have, icons and magic and crystals. And also too, this may sound silly to say, or maybe that I just like completely went over my head, but I think maybe they can actually give like a little bit better exposition somewhere in this DLC on what the icons actually even are, because I don't think that exposition on what the icons actually are is really given in like a very explicit way.
If I'm curious, Baby Sale, on your thoughts on that, because two things I'll add to that was, one, yeah, they keep saying Barnabas, like they mention like 7 times that he's from that southern continent, and it's like, I just want to see what's going on in the rest of the world. Yeah, I mean, it could just be blighted over for all I know, but like, I am curious about that. And then when it comes to the dominance, it's funny because Barnabas asked that, what are the dominants? And that was in one of the trailers. That was pretty, late game dialogue. I was shocked actually how many. I know they do it really well, but there's a lot of lines of dialogue and moments, even like when Clive is lifting up the his fist and it's like inflamed in fire and whatnot. That's pretty much toward the end of the game, and I thought that was kind of early on. If I, from when I watched the trailer of like him, sort of becoming Ifrit. But in terms of what the dominants are, it seemed like either I can't remember if it was Ultima who was saying it or if it was Barnabas, but somebody was saying that like, it seemed like they asked for they seemed like they had asked Ultima or some kind of godlike figure for power in exchange. There was like some kind of dialogue at some point. I don't know if it was in that interdimensional rift or if it was with Barnabas at some point or after you killed Barnabas. It seemed like there was some explanation that like there was a prayer to sort of get the powers so that they can. I don't know. I'm forgetting it right now.
No, you're right. So it wasn't during the Ultima speech. The Ultima speech did not do a ton to explain icons. The most of what we get about where the icons come from come in Ash, like come in Willowed, even with Edda in the descriptions around Edda, and then in the active time lore, and then in some of the books you get to read as to how the dominants sort of break the, just almost as dominance as a role kind of broke the bearer metric, like the bearer slavery construct. Dominance emerging broke that. But it is clear though that dominants are part of Ultima's plan, because the body that they show, and then you see all those like unnamed icons in the final battle, those do seem to be like part of the grand plan. And that's this idea that like that feeds into this idea that Ultima is like, even though there's this incredible intellect and power from Ultima, and that he's very ahead of the game and he can predict human behavior, the thing that he's missing, the togetherness, the power of humanity, the power of love, all that stuff, is still ultimately his downfall. But he still does understand humanity enough that he knows what's going to happen as a result of their evolution, right? So he's got kind of like a physical understanding of everything that's going to evolve. It is implied that the Circle of Malleus is written by, or is drawn by people that worship Ultima and commune with Ultima. So it does imply that there's a design element from Ultima within those 8 icons. Also, there's 8 mother crystals, 8 icons. They seem to have an elemental thing. So that does seem to be really indicative that all of the icons were an emergent property of the evolution plan that Ultima put in place. That Joshua breaks the mold, or that Rosaria breaks the mold with Phoenix, is really interesting. And so it's why it ends up being their advantage. The primary advantage that the protagonists have is the Phoenix, so that's what throws the whole system out of balance. But there is definitely more like mechanically interesting stuff that could be shown about where the fuck they came from. So, okay. Oh man. Fabergejo says, or Fabergejo, sorry. It's never explained, but once you find out there are 8 mother crystals instead of 5, it would seem there's an elemental crystal for each icon, like Final Fantasy V or Secret of Mana. Would you like to see that explored, how it ties to creation of icons? Yes. We accidentally answered your question early. DID, Says, I know a lot of people notice the similarities to Cloud charging through Bahamut Sin's Mega Flare attack in AC when Ifrit Risen goes to space. With Bahamut, did anyone catch the Omni/V5 reference when Ifrit Risen does the multi-hit attack before the space battle begins? It's the same choreography and even the final attack at the top. Just a fun reference I haven't seen anyone talk about yet. You know, I'm going to be honest, I did not notice that. So good job.
But that's a very CBU3 thing. Oh, go on, B.
My husband pointed it out when we were playing it. He was like, "Oh, there's Omni Slash." I was like, "Oh, I didn't see that. Wow,
That's cool."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's typical CBU3. It's just like there's references like that everywhere. And I'm going to tell you something that I really want to see in the DLC. Speaking of references everywhere, where's Gilgamesh at?
Yeah.
Oh, and Omega. I feel like the interdimensional rift. I would love to go back there because I love that space,
It's
and
a
I
free
feel
cam
like
mod.
if you, because that was kind of a railroaded area in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. There was no monsters or encounters. If you went back there, that's where they would be most likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad there was nothing there. I love that it was just purely a lore moment, though. Like, that was just such a great.
I would like
That
to
was
be
such
able
a
to go
great-
back
yeah.
to a dungeon though. Like it would be cool if there was like a secret dungeon where they like reward you with extra answers and stuff like that, like an end game dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
I would love that. I felt really missing there. Okay, Kino asks, was I the only one who wished to see Annabella's reaction to Joshua being alive before losing Olivier and going crazy? And reaction to Clive also being a dominant? Do you think she would feel guilty, or do you think she is even capable of feeling guilt? Good question.
I think there was something interesting because I was rewatching some cutscenes before this because I know the focus was on the ending, but I wanted to get my hand on like a lot of the characters too. I didn't get through all of them, but the last one that I saw was that scene with Annabella where she slits her throat after seeing Joshua. I think there was something to be found in her reaction to Joshua because when she sees Joshua, she says, you will not take me, Shadow. Get away from me.
Right.
And slits her throat. And she obviously has been messing around with Ultima and doing and sort of getting into sort of these arcane, like dynamics with her son is even like I'm curious what you guys think about the physical form of Olivier because he kind of disappears. It's not even a body. He just sort of disappears. Obviously he's controlled or a vessel for Ultima. Even just by the way he talks and his eyes and all of that. But it seems like she's been messing around with some really freaky stuff, and she thinks it's some kind of mind trick from Ultima, and doesn't even believe what she's seeing. That was my interpretation of that moment, though.
What are you guys' thoughts?
I figured that the real Olivier died maybe a little bit before that. It's really interesting that I don't know, like we never really were explained why Joshua was sickly. I always thought that there was going to be more of a reason to that, especially with the blight and stuff. And I felt like there was a little bit of an implication. It was the same for Olivier. And you have to wonder if maybe that had something to do with how she raised them in some kind of way. I don't know if that's just like a mother's perspective. I was very bothered by her, but I also respect the performance behind her. I think that was incredible, and the way that she does end up taking her own life kind of takes away everybody wanted to kill her.
Yeah.
And the fact that you don't get to is just like, that sucks, but it doesn't seem like it matters much in the grand scheme. I can't talk the grand scheme of anything anyways. I do think that she would not have believed that they were Joshua and Clive anyways. I think she was already way too far gone. and that whatever Olivier was in that moment was not the actual child anymore, that it was probably just like a husk of Ultima.
I kind of, I had a similar kind of takeaway, which was that Olivier had the same sickness that Joshua had, and it has something to do with Annabella's line of lineage. And because I actually think that the Ifrit part of Clive's lineage came from Annabella and not his father. I don't think it was the Rosarian line. And so I think that whatever happened with both of them, it was actually Joshua's Phoenix powers that was able to, I don't know, resist ultimately, the kind of poison, the mythos poison that was very strong in Annabella's line. And so I'm of the mind that the difference between like, say, Joshua and Olivier is that Olivier could not have taken his father's icon because that icon already existed in Dion. And that Clive was not resistant, but because of the way that he was raised, he became pure mythos. And so I think Olivier was just sort of doomed to be that thrall. So that was the way that I interpreted it from like a mechanical perspective. It is absolutely not explained though. Like it is really vague. It is one of those scenes where I completely understand why they did it the way that they did. I think every single performance was amazing. And I really liked that, like, the idea of us not killing her was sort of central to their not being actual villains in this, just sort of victims, hurting, making other victims in the situation. However, my internal, like, desperate for catharsis person inside of me was like, it would have been really nice to see a character kill her, like, just like her try to like flame out and turn all blue-eyed, and then like just some character slits her throat or something or kills her. And I think that, like, I'm tied between who I would have wanted to see that happen from, and it's like 50% Joshua, because that would have been really like,
Joshua for sure. Yeah.
Joshua, hell yeah. And then the other one would be Jill, because I just like the idea of Jill coming up and being a protector of the two brothers, and also just more moments for Jill would have been nice, personally.
Yeah.
But I get it.
Yeah. For me with Annabelle, like, I feel like I wanted her to live just a little bit longer, to have more dialogue with Clive and Joshua, because I feel like there was a lot to talk about between them, and I wanted it to be explored at a slower, more thorough pace. And I feel like, the moment they got confronted with her, she just freaked out and died. And I just think that it would have been like more cathartic to have spent a little bit more time with her being confronted by, Clive as he is, finding out Joshua's alive and kind of dealing with that. And so I think that would have been a lot more satisfying than the way things played out.
Yeah. It's funny because, like, on paper and when you describe it, I see that. But I remember in the moment, for whatever reason, like, I remember thinking, I like how kind of quiet all of this is.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just because it was a bold choice versus even the correct choice, because maybe it would have been even better to do it the way that you just said, but like, or more satisfying or whatever. But there was something to it that, like, all this time has passed between them, and She hasn't really been that much involved, and she is sort of an afterthought in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, she was this incredible instigator of this like horrible moment in their lives, but they've almost grown past that in a way. At least that was how I took it in the moment. But like,
right. I feel like
it was
it's kind
definitely
of
a
a
bold choice and the unexpected
yeah,
one. You definitely expect where you were talking about having more of a meaty
right.
bit of confrontation.
It's kind of an issue that I have like with a lot of the game storytelling in general is that like I feel like it's kind of the opposite of what other Final Fantasies do, and like especially even 14, where I feel like a lot of other titles they keep characters alive long past their expiration date and they keep them going, and sometimes especially nowadays as they have a tendency to even bring characters back to life. But I think in 16 there was, if they would have kept some characters alive a little longer, it would have probably benefited those characters and the narrative as a whole. Like for me, one of the key things that I've been preaching is that they should have kept Benedicta alive a little longer. In fact,
Yes.
I think it would have actually been more powerful if she outlived Sid and she became an ally after Sid died, and like she would have like it would have caused like this huge turning point for her to become more like the Benedicta that Sid knew.
1,000,000%.
Yeah, and that would have been like a very point, and you still would have probably killed her like later on, but you would have done it in this point that would have felt very full circle and very satisfying to know that she became the Benedicta that Sid believed in, rather than her just dying in kind of a flat way that didn't really do much other than to serve as like the first real icon.
Well, and as a
She just sort of lost
catalyst,
control.
Right.
yeah,
And the catalyst for like with the Hugo, stuff too, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Which I get, but like
I know.
I feel like there was a million other ways to approach that too.
I think,
And I feel like
yeah, I think it's one of my biggest pet peeves with the story, if I'm being honest, because I thought that a lot of what her character was like this kind of powerful meta commentary on how women have to make value and survive in patriarchal societies, and how when you introduce power to that it's an interesting look. And so for her fate, ultimately her final fate, to still be as a tool for some other man's administrations, felt like kind of personally devastating to me. I was bummed about it because I really liked the character, and also I just don't think we should necessarily just always assume people like women that are sexually progressive or awakened or sexual in nature are bad. I didn't like the demonization of her particularly, but that's obviously has political leanings that I'm not immune to having. Sorry, guys. But yeah, I definitely agree that was kind of a weakness there.
To take it back to like sorry.
No, it's okay. I was just gonna say that I saw a lot of discourse on this when the game was coming out and certain leaks were coming out, and that was kind of one of the things that I found was heavily leaked and over exaggerated. And then there was a lot of well, she deserved it. But in comparison, look at a character in the series that's so beloved. It's Beatrice, who essentially does her job, slaughters an entire race almost, and is still a well-loved character. And I feel like there's a lot of her in Benedicta.
That's such a good
I saw
comparison.
so much Beatrix potential in her too. Like totally, I totally thought about that. And to take it back to the beginning of like the conversation of like ambiguity and character fates and whatnot. It's funny because I could be satisfied with almost any fate for Clive, any fate for Joshua, but like I do agree with you guys that like the Benedicta one is probably the one I'm unsatisfied with. because there was so much potential, and they started to explore some of it, right? When they show more of her background, and they show that moment where she was getting mugged, and then like, and they there were so many teases of like that history that she had with Sid and the decisions that she made and why she made the decisions she made. That it would have been interesting to then see how that played out if she had lived versus just losing control and dying in that icon fight.
Yeah,
I think it also
it felt like such a waste.
It does, and I think it also bleeds into who Hugo is as well, because I wish that I got a little bit more from Hugo. I think he is obviously an incredible villain, but his general purpose is revenge because of something that was essentially a lie, which I think is still incredible writing. Like, it's really interesting, all of the different webs that are there, but it also made me sad when I was like, oh, that's all he was. He was just a guy who was desperately in love.
Yeah, and I love the I love the scene where he's like hallucinating out to like Clive, like essentially like, cucking him. And he's just like going mad, and I'm just like, this is great.
Yeah. There was something interesting too about going back to Benedicta that I was thinking about was I loved her reaction when she lost her icon power for that temporary moment, because it, like, there was something interesting. I don't think it was a big idea or theme or anything, but I just found it interesting how central that was to her identity, or her self identity, or whatever it is.
Right.
Because she really seemed to like lose herself for a moment when she didn't have Garuda to summon anymore.
Well,
And,
yeah.
And how that compared and contrasted to like Clive, and how he absorbs all the icons, and I think if you'd asked him, he'd probably give it up in a heartbeat to not have that sort of power. There's just something interesting to me about, like, I think it was just the performance too. I think it was just the acting of that moment of like her losing that it was like, oh wow.
Well, I think it was, I mean, it was one of those first moments I'm like, this game's really tackles adult themes in a way that's different than any previous Final Fantasies. Is because when she loses her power, she recalls a moment when she was taken advantage of by men, and how, because that's what powerlessness felt like for her. But the contrast is, when she was dreaming of a memory she had where she was about to be taken advantage of, but was saved by Sid. And so, there was this, so her last moment before she loses control is this moment that she's remembering being saved by Sid. And it's like harsh and dark, that's what makes her lose control again, is, that there's this somebody that's like, oh, hey, here's this, random woman in the woods for me to take advantage of. And, then, she Garuda's out and then starts flying around. And it's crazy. There's good thematic bones to that story, but it was cut too short. And it's a story that like really needs, I think, space in the Final Fantasy fucking community. I do want to say about Hugo, I think one of the things that I really liked about Hugo was, again, stuff that you have to like look too deeply to kind of see. Like, the bones of Hugo are that he broke his class, right? He was born outside of the ruling class. Like, he's not wealthy, and so because he emerged as a dominant, became a hero to the impoverished soldiers of Damek. And so he was like an icon of, breaking the chains, ironically, of that. But his reaction to that was to just constantly covet things. Like, so he was almost like, a caricature of, greed. So like all of the stuff in his palace is absurdly large and overt and lavish. He has all this extra jewelry and stuff like that. He's really like, he's just like, he wants things. That's his identity, is that he wants things. And you find out that the reason for that is because he didn't have them growing up. He was a poor child that was given power. And that's what happens when you give people in that kind of system like an undue, resurgence of power. Like they try and feed all of the needs that they weren't given as children, and he continues to do that until he dies from it. And there's a cool story in that, but they didn't really show it. They just showed that he was pissed off about Benedicta. Even he was reduced as to like kind of not being seen as a full person. But then again, you have this huge real estate issue in this game. This game was long. So when do you show that stuff? Because all of that stuff would have been good to show, So
Yeah.
it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, and that's kind of the thing too, is that I feel like since this game was so long, there was a lot of opportunities. Especially when you kind of reminded me too that like the last scene before Benedicta like rages out and goes into Garuda was that scene where she, remembers Sid and how he saved her. And I'm just thinking, oh, that would have made her surviving past him had even more gravity, and her like change in character, after that would have had so much weight. But all of this is just for me to plug what I've been trying to tell Square Enix for a long time, and that is just make a shorter game, bro. Just put out a 20-hour Final Fantasy. They just keep making these long Final Fantasies that don't need to be this long, and this goes for Remake too, where I thought that game should be 20 hours, and I think this game should have been like 20 hours. And put out a 20-hour game, and it's gonna be okay, and it can only have the banger moments in it, and you can use all of this time to your advantage, rather than trying to fluff out and get as many hours as you possibly can for a marketing bullet point. But I think you'll make a better game if you just 20 hours solid. It's good moments.
I really loved the length of this because I haven't played a Final Fantasy in this way where I really sort of like just embraced all of it since back in the PS1 days, like back when I played FF7, FF8, FF9. Like even if I have varying like degrees of love for each of those, like I haven't felt like I've lived in a Final Fantasy world like that in a long time. Especially given how much flesh and like flavor was given to all the NPCs and all the towns, especially through the side quests. Like, I do think they maybe try to bite off a little more than they could chew, because I do think they had to sort of shortcut a couple of the villain arcs or the antagonist arcs, because they also had to fit in Ultima. So there was a little bit of a reduction of Hugo into this angry man, and there was that missed opportunity with Garuda and Benedicta that we just talked about, and even Barnabas. There's a lot of moments where we confront him, but I felt like there could have even been a few more beats with him.
Could have been a Barnabas Odin fight.
To see more of.
Yeah.
So yeah, they really did try to take on. I mean, they tried to create a really big game, and they did make a really big game that I had spent way too long playing. Like it took me 94 hours to roll credits on that thing, which I know is a little just my pace too. Like when I played Remake, I know a lot of people beat that game like 35 hours, and my final game clock was like 49 hours, because I like to walk around and listen to everyone and sort of absorb as much as I possibly can. But like, it's a long game. Like even at that pace, even at the pace I was playing, I thought I was going to reach the end by like 65 hours or something. It just kept going, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't really mind how long the game was. I do think there were some pacing and quest issues. I think they could have restructured that a little bit, but it's sort of a thing with the way that team operates too, is that you have to go through a little bit of pain before you get to the good parts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with the side quests in particular. I think they could have gone with a few less, but you know, that's fine. I I do. Speaking of side quests, somebody did ask in chat about a specific side quest character, um, and they wanted to know what our thoughts were on the Dame, which is Isabel. Um, and personally, I liked the entire arc around the Dame, and they were the only two early or mid game side quests that I could even tolerate. I hated the first set of side quests, but the ones around the Dame and the ones around Northreach, and then the ones, you know, it was like a side quest that was basically a main quest where you go and, you know, find the comb, so to speak. Those actually worked really well for me, and then I really liked going back and helping the Dame kind of, you know, take control of that area. That, you know, those are one of my favorite, you know, set of areas there. What were your guys' thoughts on those side quests, and side characters in general? Like, what were standout side quests for you?
Yeah, I mean the specifically to the Dame, I love the end of that of her of that arc, the under new management too. I had written down actually some names of my favorite side quests as I was playing the game, because I was like, if I ever make a video or something, I was probably gonna mention a couple of them. But that one was really cool because like Northreach at first, I wasn't super into a lot of the side quests there specifically. Like, they're kind of funny ones. Like, you remember you fight those guards who are just like, you know, the Dame thinks you're good enough. Well, let me test you, and then you
Yeah.
beat the hell out of them. And it's a really funny one. But I don't know. I didn't really feel much about the Dame specifically as a character, or a lot of the characters in Northreach, until I played more of those side quests. And then like you come to the end, and like the whole theme of this game is about like upending these systems and flipping them, and
Yeah.
like you have this, and she has such a great moment where she is directly confronting uh the um the Oriflame guy and whatnot, and like they're trying to talk down to her as a sex worker, and she just pushes back, and like, and it is true that she is kind of the beating heart of that community, and like
Yeah.
everyone rallies around her. So like the fact that it culminates with her kind of getting control and helping to sort of remake what Northreach is and what it's all about, I thought was really satisfying. So yeah, I mean, some other ones that stood out though, I love the For Great Justice. That was such a shock to me, like that Quentin was just like this, this someone
Yeah.
capable of what he was capable of.
Yeah.
Because he was sort of an odd, he was an odd duck all throughout the
Yeah.
game. Like every time you talk to him, just the way he talked, and then you find out he was like kind of this government person, or I forget exactly what he was, this magistrate or something. And it's like, okay, now your voice is adding up, and I'm understanding why you are where you are. And then like
Yeah.
the fact that he's been building Lost Wing is like this secret place to sort of launch this attack against the people who he think did a really great injustice. That was just such a shocking quest, and that one's really interesting. And I'm sure I'll pass it to others, but like I also really love the Bearer School one, which is one of the last ones that I did. In that last set of side quests, where you go into that school and you read that diary, or that journal rather, of the guy who runs the school, and he realizes that his daughter was one of the bearers there, and then he, you know, his last act is to sort of have them kill him, as sort of like an act of justice, even though it's also another traumatic sort of instruction for them to do.
Mm-hmm.
There was just a lot of the side quests toward the end like surprised me with just how good the stories were, and there were a lot more than that set.
Which, by the way, in like that same series, the side quest, it may have even been in the same side quest, there was something that like kind of flips the whole lore on its head to me. Like, it was just briefly mentioned in like one of those notes, where it was like, Yeah, actually bears used to be like worshipped. But then I can't remember the exact story behind it, but basically there was a power flip where bears went from being worshipped to being discriminated against. And over time in societies, how the roles actually shifted from bears being basically treated as like these holy entities to them being treated as like the scum of the earth. And I was just like, why is this tucked away in like a little Resident Evil note, like on a desk?
Yeah.
I'm like, this is like central world building that should have been like, kind of probably presented in the MSQ and not in, or at least if you're gonna do it in a side quest, make it a much more central side quest. Probably have introduced it, maybe not earlier, but like you could have. It should have been something more front and center. I feel like is what I'm really trying to get at.
I do think that they reproduce the lore construct behind why the bearers are have been systematically pushed to a servitudinal role when you get to Ash, and the scene with Barnabas explains that because the bearers resist being Akashic, and Akashic is the goal of Ultima, then it's just like the details of when the systems start to like enact upon current society, that so it's just like kind of the why and the when was missing, but I think the construct was pretty solid in that scene. But there is some pacing issues, particularly once you get to Ash, where you're like, it's hard to pay attention too. So
there, I mean, it is really interesting though, because and if you read, because then if you go back into like if you go talk to Harpocrates now and you go into like the Myths of the Realm specifically, like that folder, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that even further clarifies like that whole like the accord. I forget the exact name of it, but there was basically an accord that was signed after the bearers and basically there was a war between bearers and non-bearers at one point, and there were and the bearers lost that because they were just outnumbered or something, and at the end of it, because they did have an elevated place in society, and then because of that, the outcome of that's when the accord was signed, that like you are like the bearers are slaves, and like the whole like paradigm that we know was established, and it was super interesting.
That is.
But it's in a side quest, and I remember reading or I was listening to a review, and somebody said I hadn't finished all the side quests or something, and then I was understanding how that affected their takeaway on the game and the story. And then there's a lot of stuff that is like technically in side quests, like that final moment with Clive and Jill. In the flowers, in that scene that like looks so much like FF8. It's just like that's a side quest technically.
B, what are your thoughts? What was your favorite side quest?
I loved Mid, which I knew I was going to, but I was a little bit let down with the fact that we didn't end up building an airship, but I kind of respect her choice at the same time too. I love Goots and Karen. I think that Goots, I just wanted to make sure he was safe all the time. He's so perfect. I just think everybody in the hideaway brought something to the table, and it makes, I think they're the reason that I'm always going to miss the world of Valisthea until or if we ever get side content. And I compared it to Mother 3. Mother 3 is the sequel to Earthbound. It's one of my favorite games, and it was a really hard game to say goodbye to because every single character in that world was a character that was written for you to care for. And they all individually say goodbye to you, and that's just kind of the same vibe I got by the end of it. I felt compelled to do every side quest, and I'm somebody who sometimes will skip side quests. And there's a lot of people I've encountered who are like, oh yeah, I beat the game in 30 hours. And I'm like, how? did you not want to do the side quests? Like, especially the Ambrosia one. That was such a. As soon as that popped up, I was like, that's got to be Ambrosia. There's no way. But
I understand how people skipped it though, like because the early ones are so seemingly mundane. Like, let's be honest, you're delivering food, you're delivering planks of wood. Like, that's your first exposure to the side quests, and like, I can understand some. I was even that way, right? Where I was gonna do everything no matter what, but like, if I didn't love this franchise so much and like want to sort of explore every nook and cranny of this game, you know, I would probably skip them too, because it's like I just don't understand what I'm doing. Like, it doesn't seem.
Yeah. The first few side quests teach the player don't do side quests.
Exactly.
That's the core issue. Yeah.
I will say the most shocking side quest for me was the one with Theo and what happens to Theo.
Yeah.
And I was actually bored. I was falling asleep. I wasn't paying attention. And all of a sudden I'm doing this dragon fight. And I'm like, well, Theo's here. He's a bearer. He's probably kind of resistant. And then all of a sudden he's Akashic. And I'm like, holy shit. And then, you know, everything happens.
Yeah.
And it just caught me so off guard. And then from then on out, any other side quest after that, I was like, okay, I have to fully pay attention because I do not want that happening again. It caught me so off guard. And
and part of it too was that, like, I don't know what it was about that specific time, but as soon as I'm at Tabor and we do the first Theo side quest, I'm like, this game is a C+. I hate the side quest so much that I had like kind of built this resentment against the existence of Theo. So when he starts to turn Akashic and then he like spends his final moments kind of trying to, like, you know, like he retains some agency, which is unlike the way we've seen any other Akashic. I was like, this is gnarly. This is the only thing they could have done to Theo to make me feel things, and they did it. And there's so many side quests like that where you're like, you really have to buy into, I guess I'm a completionist, I guess I'm doing side quests, because if you do, the payoff is like this really incredible like arc to a full complete story. But like Ryan said, it is brutal. It is a brutal journey to get there. And
CB3 makes you feel the pain, like you're saying, pain before payoff. That's like the motto. They must hang it hung in their walls at some point. The one other one, I know it's like we're spending so long on these side quests, but like I think it's worth it, especially because of the rightful shit that they get, but also because they actually do nail some of them. And the I did love the mid one and the very ending, which she does make that choice about the engines. Just like her performance for a second. I just want to talk about, like, I think Mid's performance was so good. We talked so much about so many of the performances in this game for so many good reasons. And like I just really love the Mid performance. I think there's like so much going on, especially like in that scene where she's doing, where she has the model airship. I think whoever that VA is, crushed it. And then the other one that is like the final Gav side quest.
I know.
Where you sort of learn his story, and then and how he was like sort of the scared kid in a lot of ways. And then because all throughout the game, like when I first met Gav, I was annoyed with Gav. I'm like, because he's getting himself into these situations that I have to pull him out of. I have to save his life at least once. It felt like more than once. And it's like, are you good enough for this? Like, are you good doing this? Are you sure you should be doing this? And then he may have been over his head a little bit, but it's because he was sort of like driven by this, like desire to sort of protect her. I forget exactly what the story was, his backstory on that, but I remember it hitting me and being like, oh wow, there's so much more here than I thought, with sort of the foundation of who he is as a character.
Yeah. You know, personally, in terms of favorite side quests, ending side quests, and just like kind of, I mean, they're all really good. You know, as soon as I kind of realized where I was like, okay, so this is going to be where we kind of say goodbye to everybody. So prepare yourself emotionally. And even with that, like the Torgal one blew my back out. Holy shit, that Torgal one.
Yeah.
Because he's you go to that little fort and he collected all the wood things, and I'm an animal person, so that was that it's kind of hard to beat that, but
Did you take Joshua with, by the way? Because I found out that you can do the Joshua quest before that, and there's more dialogue.
I did.
Oh,
I did.
Shit.
So I did do the Joshua one first. I did the Joshua and Jill ones first. The Jill one was good. I was like, I was shocked that they did the Jill thing as a side quest. It was great, but like, it's like, whoa, they basically just got married as a side quest. And one of the things that's interesting about the side quest too, and Helios points it out as a question, is that doing the side quest does impact the way that you feel about the character's fates in the end too. So I think people will have this very, very, I think, linear perspective of what happens at the end of Final Fantasy XVI versus a multitude of ones had you done the side quests or not. And I have criticisms of that story structure, but it worked really well here, so I'm giving it kind of a pass. But I did the Jill and Joshua ones first and I didn't know that they were going to have them join my party for the rest of those. So I'm really fortunate that I did that. But I wish that those would have been plus icon quests. That is a design nitpick. Like if you would have, because if you had a quest that had like a green thing, green like exclamation point, I think you'd be like, oh, you can do that side quest. But there was an air of optionality to it that made me, maybe pay less attention. But the plus sign ones are like, they give you shit. Like they give you ambrosia or more potions, which we did not fucking need.
I feel regret now. In fact, like I feel regret now because I saved the Joshua one because I was like, let me do all the other side quests because Joshua is probably going to be the most emotionally impactful. It's the most, sort of direct character. I didn't know obviously what it would be, but I was like, let me save Joshua. Let me do everything else. I did all the hunts. I did every quest. I did every like Alliant report quest. I did every single thing before going to the Joshua one. And now I'm sitting here like, man, I kind of wish I had Joshua for the
now
quest.
Because the other one I missed, and as soon as I did it, because I took the hunts as they showed up.
Yeah.
There's a hunt for the Morble carrot, and that's like a deep cut back to Evilise. There's carrot in every single one, and I instantly was like, oh man, I wonder if Joshua is complaining the whole time that you fight if he's in your party. So now I'm like, I want to replay and go do that hunt with Joshua in my party and Jill in my party to hear any of that extra exchange.
Right, because he hates carrots. Yeah. And also if you don't do Torgal before Jill, you miss Torgal sleeping in the lilies during that scene. And that is something that happened to me. I did miss that. So somebody pointed that out. But I saw it later on someone else's playthrough. I'm going to tell you though, really quick, my favorite side quest was the Harpocrates Dion one. Was fantastic. Yeah. There was something really beautiful, just and personal about him being a different type of lily, but it not being like this weird tropey thing. And then Harpocrates having like this kind of, it was like this way of Harpocrates like saying, hey, you're forgiven, I love you, you're my student. And and there's just this beautiful acceptance. I'm actually having trouble talking about it because it gets me kind of that way, emotional, but it was really really effective at kind of describing that there's nothing, that there is always going to be an otherness to being queer as a queer myself, but there's also good representation that makes it's like not the primary thing about Dion at all, but it does exist, and there's a way to acknowledge it as a difference without it being tropey or there's a way of giving it representation that makes it normalized. And I think that Dion's character was done really effectively, and that Harpocrates did that particularly well in that side quest. So that one had the most emotional weight for me.
And I felt the heartbreak. You could see the heartbreak on Harpocrates' face when Dion rejects it, because Harpocrates knows that Dion is like raring to like sacrifice himself, you know? And he wants him to accept it, but he's also going to respect the choice. And it's such a bittersweet sort of moment just that moment specifically, like the rejection of it, because like I respected Dion's choice just like Harpocrates did, but I wanted him to accept it,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we probably have time for one more question, and I actually, instead of giving it to the audience, want to give it to you guys. So why don't you guys each, ask a question of us, of all of us to answer, and then we'll say goodbye, say our goodbyes.
All right.
So Ryan, do you have a question for us?
Sure. If there was one thing you could change about this game, whether it's story or gameplay wise, what is the thing that you would change above all else?
Good question. Subtxt, you have one yet for us?
I feel like I have a few, so it's kind of hard to narrow it down. I do think there's the difficulty thing that we all talk about, so I don't have to like go on too long about that. I just wish there was a little more like there was another option, at least on the first playthrough. I'm finding myself in New Game Plus sort of. I read someone say that they debuffed their equipment in the Final Fantasy mode, so so I just equipped the lowest level armor that I could, just so I can take a little more damage in fights. And that is sort of livened up a little bit. But yeah, even in Final Fantasy mode, it's very easy to sort of hit it. I think when it comes from a storytelling standpoint, one of the struggles that I was having was, and I think it's a fair criticism of some of the reviews. There are reviews that I didn't agree with a lot of, but like the one thing is sort of this more modern model of storytelling, and I think the prologue does it really well, where you're very much guided through. It's maybe a little too cutscene heavy at times, but like there's a really nice flow to like everything. Like you feel the flow of the narrative flow and the gameplay flow that goes along with it. Mm-hmm. And then within the core game, once you get into the real game, it's like very like the standard two shots between characters, and you're just going through this dialogue, and there's kind of an old sort of feel to it. Old feel to a lot of the NPC interactions and character interactions versus these like very well produced ones. They still have that in the main cutscenes, but a lot in the middle ones, it's really easy to sort of have that sleepy feeling, right? Like when you're doing that side quest of like, there's a reason you're starting to fall asleep, and it's a little bit of like how the game is constructed. And a nitpick for me, one of my biggest nitpicks is something they do in 14, where like you'll have a conversation between two people, and then it'll cut away and then cut back into that same conversation. And usually when they do it in 14, it's like a later point in time, right? Because like you as the character or some character explains something to the character that you're interacting with. But there's a lot of like two people talking, and then camera cuts away, and then camera comes back. It descends from the top slowly. It takes 15 seconds to like drop down on the two characters so they continue the conversation they were just having 15 seconds ago. And it's like there's just this sort of slowness to how the scenes are paced and done at times. That was just drove me a little crazy. But then I ended up loving the characters and everything so much that it, I looked past it at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. But I just wish, a lot of those core moments were just a little more polished in how they were presented.
Fair.
It's it does have the MMO CBU thing, and I get it. They're an MMO team, right?
Sure.
I was a little surprised by how much it still had a lot of those like artifacts of MMO game design.
Personally, how I'd answer the question, and then I'll let B answer and then ask her own question, is the gameplay lacked RPG elements. There was kind of a lack of customization, in terms of like equipment and problem solving. There is this, and I get it, there's a very Suzuki style, which is that you could essentially have any combination of any iconic abilities and win a fight, like anything. So there is never any strategic choices that you make specific for the boss fight. It was we can Swiss Army knife our way through any problem. And so like things like the upgrade system, the crafting system, the skill trees had, much more, I think, linearity and simplicity than even games that aren't in the RPG genre, like God of War. God of War Ragnarok did technically have more RPG elements than Final Fantasy 16, and that doesn't mean that Final Fantasy 16 isn't a Final Fantasy. It is for a ton of reasons. But I really thought that maybe it would be a little closer to remake and kind of the way that it hybridized these concepts very, very well. And that is my biggest number one criticism of it as a game. The secondary stuff we've already kind of got into, like the pacing with side quests, and then the big one for me is that every Final Fantasy has like the secret dungeon where you go and like after the boss or right before you go do the final boss, you can go do this optional secret dungeon, either to get like fed mega cool weird underground lore that isn't necessary for the final but it's still cool, or some secret awesome weapon. Like there was none of that kind of optional stuff, and I felt like for a game about breaking fate, it would have been nice to have a little bit of like agency in that, and so I do miss that a little bit.
There was almost a tease of one that I remember Red Viper mentioned in the chat, like I don't know, like an hour ago or something. But it was like there was a door that it's like a relic. It's like an ancient door, sort of like the apothecary door, and it's like near East Pool. It's off this like side path, and I remember running into it because I was just exploring before I got to the apothecary properly. And then so I unlocked the apothecary door, and I was like, "Oh, cool! The flames of the Phoenix unlock these doors." So I tried to go back to that door, and like it just doesn't do anything. And then I remember once I had Joshua in my party late game, I ran back to that door. It's like, "Oh, I have Joshua, I have the Phoenix with me. Maybe the door will open." Door still doesn't do anything. And I'm like, "What is this door? It's still bothering me. Maybe it'll be a DLC thing, but like I don't know." There's, to your point though, of like no hidden thing. It's like, there was such a tease of it though with that freaking door. That drove me a little crazy.
Yeah, that was weird. That was weird.
Yeah.
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 I guess my own answer to that question would be, it's kind of hard because there's actually like a lot of things
Sure.
I would add. If there was like one thing that I think was like most important, I think it would probably be the difficulty as well. The game is just so easy that you never have to engage with any of its systems like whatsoever. So if I was to not reuse a thing, one thing that I would have added to the game to really enhance the feeling of it would be like I would have probably added like Metroidvania elements to the world design. So it would have been like, okay, well, after you unlock Titan, you're able to go here and unlock this gate that only Titan can get through, and then now you're able to discover this other secret place that, and so I would have that you were constantly unlocking like these little dungeons from like the Fallen, and one would unlock the other, and as you got more icon powers, they would kind of like chain into themselves. But like that'd probably be like the biggest
Yeah,
like specific change I would make. Like,
be perfect. It'd be
yeah,
perfect.
I was like, oh man, now I'm like actually like paying attention to like the world design, because like, what if there's like an icon gate that I can get through now that I noticed earlier that I didn't go through, and then yeah, that would have been great.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good idea. B.
For me, I think the one thing I would love to see changed is the hunts. It felt like there wasn't much strategy behind them, and I guess since it is more of an action-focused game, you can't really have elemental differences. You can't have.
Why not?
I mean, you could, but
Yeah.
and that's one of the things I miss. I feel like the moment I picked my set of icons, I never really budged from that, and I never felt like there was much encouragement to do so either. And so that would have been something fun for them to implement into the hunts, is that, certain icons are better used against Carrot and Svarog and like all the different ones. That is something that I really like about 12, the game I keep mentioning. 16 has surpassed 12 for me story-wise, but hunting was just like the thing that made that game for me. And it, as fun as it was to do all of the hunts, I felt like there wasn't much of a payoff at the end because there wasn't as much of a challenge I would have had from them. Like, the biggest challenge was Svarog to me, because it's introduced to you probably 10 to 15 levels above what your normal level is in the game. But that's it. Like, after that, everything's kind of a cakewalk.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's no incentivization to grind. And I felt like with Final Fantasy mode, I ended up getting a little bit punished for being a completionist and doing all the side quests in the first playthrough, because I felt over leveled the entirety of Final Fantasy mode. I died less in Final Fantasy mode, than in normal mode or in action focused mode. So, that was kind of a like maybe they missed the point of a difficulty mode, etc.
I had the same behavior in the normal mode too, where I was exploring that first sort of area that they showed in the preview coverage before you go to Martha's Rest. I was walking around, I was exploring things, I was killing sort of everything that came into my path, and then I was like, and I had that behavior for a little bit, and then I leveled up, and I got afraid because I was like, wait a minute, I'm gonna keep leveling up, and I already feel way too strong, or like the game's not hard enough, so I sort of stopped. I avoided every enemy at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, like, at least that's a Final Fantasy thing. There's always, if you get too lost, you can grind, but it never felt necessary. Like, you never felt like, oh, I gotta grind and come back, which is like kind of a fun Final Fantasy feeling for me. But but B, what do you have a question for us?
I do, yes. What do you interpret by Joshua referring to it as Leviathan the Lost? What do you think happened?
Yeah, that's teasing a story right there, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You don't get a name like Leviathan the Lost by not being lost.
There's two meanings to lost, and that's something that I oversaw when I first played it. I automatically was like, oh, Leviathan's just on an adventure. He's not coming back, or she. But then afterwards, I thought a little more deeply about it. I was like, well, Leviathan could literally be lost to the world, like no longer existing, which I hope isn't the case. But I just wish there was a little bit more on Leviathan to read about. Like, we know about the different tribes, like the motes of wind, motes of fire, motes of ice and stuff, and those are tied to the different crystals that existed in the world. And we know that the crystal of that was at Zemeckis is hypothetically the crystal water, but I don't know. I feel like the implication for me there is that maybe there was a fight involving Leviathan there, because we know it was a battle of the gods. So I don't know. That's one of those things there's so much potential. I don't know how a game would play if we were playing as Leviathan. I've seen people say that Leviathan was cut probably because you're not near the water enough to like have Leviathan. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what your theories are.
I mean, the first thing that came to mind was the connection to Titan Lost.
Yeah.
And how I thought there was an incident. There was definitely an incident where they became Leviathan Lost. I do think too that there's a possibility that that if they're going to tell a story about Leviathan that's contemporary to 878, like the 800s, the phase of the game that we're in, it would have to necessarily happen in the quote unquote lost continent.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only place you could tell that story. But I would prefer, and I do want to see what's going on over there. I really do. I want to see the continent where maybe there's a little bit more, diversity, and see what's going on there. I want to see that, but I would prefer to see what the story of Leviathan be something that happened in the past surrounding maybe the fall of Zemeckis, and maybe that battle involved Leviathan becoming lost somehow, but I'm kind of not even sure that icons were around during that period of time. And I know that's crazy to sound like, but remember the Magitech machines that the Fallen used were called iconoclasts. So there's a noted distinction between the way that the by the way, that iconoclastes too is a play on Ecclesiastes too, which is a Greek word. Anyways, I digress. But so there's this possibility that the Fallen weren't really using icons at all, that they used machines that were magic powered, that icons got their namesake from. So there's vagueness there. So I would like a story about the past, with completely different characters that just give more of the world building stuff. That's more interesting to me personally than even like hearing more about the characters I know and love, except for Dion. What are you guys' thoughts?
I don't feel I feel like I'm probably one of the only people who play this game and sort of miss. Like I heard the Leviathan the Lost thing, but it feels like everyone is very obsessed with like what happened with Leviathan. As I'm like reading some of the things on Twitter and other places, I wasn't as obsessed with that question as a lot of people were. But my assumption is that because once all the icons are lost or die or whatever, or the dominants sort of die, some other person takes on that icon, right? Like, they're waiting for potentially Clive to become the Phoenix, and then it ended up becoming his brother. So it seemed like nobody has awoken to Leviathan. So when I think of Leviathan the Lost, it sounds like it's literally the icon is gone and there is no more lineage of the dominant.
Right.
So I don't know. That's my interpretation of that. And yeah, it would be cool to find out that story.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be literally that literal. Okay. Well, Subtxt. Do you have anything to add, by the way, Brian, to that one?
Oh, all I would say is I would love to see the other continent. I do think Leviathan Lost. There's so much there to really explore, but also I think that for a DLC, you have to add another icon for a game like this.
Yeah,
You have to. Yeah, there's no way that you don't, right? Because how else do you expand the gameplay of a game like this? And that is that you add an extra icon.
Yeah.
So I think that's like the only way you can go forward. And
Yeah.
the icon that makes the most sense to add is the one that's already established in the story. Like if you add another icon in there, like Diablos or something, it's gonna feel left field as hell. Or if you have like Leviathan in there that's already baked into the lore, it feels like, okay, we already know this thing's supposed to exist.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay. Subtext, you want to ask us our last question and then we'll call it?
Yeah, I had a couple questions in my mind, but I'm going to ask the one
Just
that I think
ask the one.
people want to know the most, I think.
Okay.
And I think it's if you could choose one character DLC to have, you can only choose one. You only get one of these. Which character would you want that DLC to be about?
Sid.
Jill.
Mid.
Based.
Okay, yeah, that's
Mid.
a good choice.
I'm also. I think
Yeah.
I think I'm in the Jill camp, just because I feel like I always wanted more from her. So yeah.
I think it's also an opportunity for them to address some criticism.
Uh-huh.
I think a Sid DLC could include more Benedicta and Mid, though, is one thing I have to add.
Yeah.
I know you're jealous of my choice. I get it. It's fine.
That's true, and it's also an opportunity for them to flesh out some of the lore stuff, right?
Yeah.
Since Sid is kind of aware of all these things, it can also kind of give them like give us a little bit more insight onto his awareness of those things.
The Sid DLC has like the most questions or the most like potential answers, it seems, for sure.
Right.
Sure, yeah.
The most amount of stuff can be answered there.
Totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guys, with that, goodbye. And this has been fantastic. Thank you all. And if you're listening on YouTube and you stayed all the way till the end, thank you so much. Please consider liking and subscribing and putting the little notification bell to always on so that you can hear about more fantastic updates. I've got 2 episodes planned for the rest of the month, and I'll probably have a third. So, we are going to... This won't be the last Final Fantasy XVI conversation we have, but we are going to switch gears a little bit back to 7 Rebirth, simply because we're kind of getting prepared for some, for some more stuff on that. And there's new Sleep Easy video, 5-hour video type thing. So we'll be talking about that. So YouTube, goodbye. I bid you farewell. Please subscribe to all these people. Goodbye.